Right next door to the US, a relentless war unfolds, a battle that has raged since December 2006, when Mexico declared war on its powerful drug cartels. These are no ordinary criminals. They command armies, control territories, and fight over access to the lucrative drug pathway into the US, a nation grappling with an insatiable demand for narcotics. This violent saga began under President Calderón, who deployed 6,500 soldiers to Michoacán, sparking a conflict that shows no signs of abating almost 2 decades later. These cartels extend their influence deep into the political fabric, corrupting officials in Mexico and the US. Meanwhile, a dark alliance forms with the Chinese Communist Party, supplying the cartels with the means to produce fentanyl, a scourge on American streets that's slashing life expectancy. In the face of this growing threat, the Texas Rangers took decisive action in October 2023 at one of the most notorious trafficking hotspots along the US-Mexico border. But who are these modern-day Rangers, and what drastic steps did they take to stem the tide of organized crime? As we delve into this gritty saga, we explore the strategic moves and their broader impact on the ongoing border crisis that has ensnared the United States since 2021. Let's unravel the complex web of conflict and courage in this relentless border saga. The Texas Rangers are one of the oldest police organizations in the United States and the oldest law enforcement organization with statewide jurisdiction on the North American continent. The unit originated in 1823 when Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, organized a paramilitary group to provide protection for the 600 to 700 American families who had colonized the area on invitation from the Spanish government, which then ruled Mexico, of which Texas was a part. Because these troops needed to range over broad tracts of land, they were called Rangers. This body of troops became more permanent in the 1830s, as the then self-proclaimed Republic of Texas had tensions with the newly independent Mexico. Defenders were needed at the border and against attacks by Native Americans, and the Rangers were designed to carry out both these tasks. Clashes with the Native Americans were far more frequent than the more dramatic battles with Mexico, and the Rangers continued in this service after joining the Union and officially being recognized as part of the United States following the Mexican-American War. In a convention held on January 28, 1861, Texas seceded from the Union. The Rangers did not officially participate in the American Civil War, but many of the men who made up the unit did. Terry's Texas Rangers, named after its commanding officer, Colonel Benjamin Franklin Terry, was organized later that year and fought as part of the Confederate Army. Nevertheless, the Union won the war, Texas was occupied, and the Rangers were temporarily disbanded during Reconstruction. They were instead re-regimented as the state police under the Reconstruction-era government. But after Reconstruction ended in 1873, following the previous year's highly disputed presidential election, the Rangers were reconstituted. As the frontier closed, the Rangers gradually shifted from being a paramilitary group to getting involved in investigative and police work. In 1935, about a century after their foundation, the transition was made official, as the Rangers were folded into the newly created Texas Department of Public Safety. In this capacity, they act as the State Bureau of Investigation, Texas's equivalent to the FBI. In October 2023, amid the ongoing border crisis, the Texas Rangers turned their attention to Fronton Island in the Rio Grande. This island is newly formed and did not exist when the Rangers were created. The river cut a new channel between 1852 and 1926 that gradually separated this piece of real estate from the mainland. As this separation came after the Mexican-American War and Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, there were some disputes as to the nationality of this new island. The 1848 treaty set the Rio Grande as the border between the two countries. Land north of the river was considered American territory, with the south bank being Mexican. The channel that created the island split cut it off from the mainland to the north. Did this mean that it was now part of Mexico? For decades, this question was left in legal limbo, and both sides largely stayed clear of the island. However, the issue was settled in 1976. That year, the International Boundary and Water Commission, which was created in 1889 by the United States and Mexico to handle any future territorial issues, recognized Fronton as American territory, in line with a new treaty between the two countries that came into force in 1970. Fronton Island is today considered part of Texas's Starr County. Fronton Island is uninhabited. It has a length of about 2 miles and a total area of about 160 acres. The island is largely flat, with the highest elevation of 177 feet. As nobody lives on the island, no one was around to control the growth of fauna, and thick vegetation covered it at the time of the raid. Also, because nobody lives there, Fronton Island did not have a high profile. Government agents on both sides of the border tended not to go there in order to prevent any international disputes, even after the questions about its ownership were settled in the 70s. As early as the 1980s, the island showed its potential as a stronghold for criminal activity. On June 10, 1983, 7 convicts were working in a prison yard on the Mexican side of the border. Sensing an opportunity, the criminals used their tools to attack a guard, striking him in the head. They then took his weapon, escaped through a gate that had been opened for a lumber delivery, and fled to Fronton Island. 3 of the men were being held in connection with the murders of 2 Mexican federal police officers. Authorities from both sides of the border cooperated in their attempts to arrest the fugitives, but it wasn't an easy task. The dense foliage on Fronton Island made surveillance and intelligence gathering nearly impossible. Helicopter observation proved nearly useless. 3 of the fugitives were not apprehended until the 12th. Reports on the other 4 are difficult to find. The vegetation on Fronton Island makes it ideal not only for hiding people, but for the cartel to conceal their illicit cargoes. The Rio Grande is also shallow in this area and relatively easy to cross compared to the deeper areas elsewhere. To make the island even more desirable as a transit point, there is a well-established road network near the river crossing on the Mexican side of the border, making it easy for the cartels to move their wares. All of these factors made Fronton Island a perfect place to act as a hotspot for organized crime, and the Mexican drug cartels have long used it as a transit point for narcotics, weapons, and human trafficking. To combat these trends and the massive surge in border crossings, the state of Texas launched Operation Lone Star in March 2021. The mission's objective was to deter illegal immigration and the trafficking in weapons and narcotics across the border by the cartels. It began with Governor Abbott's disaster declaration in 53 counties in the state that month. Such a declaration gave him the authority to deploy the Texas National Guard to the border. Operation Lone Star is a joint effort between the Texas Department of Public Safety and the Texas Military Department, which the state National Guard falls under. Texas's governor's office claims that as of March 2024, Operation Lone Star has resulted in the apprehension of over 500,000 people crossing the border, over 40,000 criminal arrests, 36,000 of which were felony arrests, and the seizure of 469 million doses of fentanyl. However, independent investigations have revealed that at least 2,000 of these arrests had no clear link to Operation Lone Star, casting doubt on some of the other numbers. Nevertheless, a year after it started, Operation Lone Star began to show results. Illegal entries into Texas did increase between March 21 and March 22, but at a rate of 6.9% compared to the 36.3% in Arizona, 30% in California, and 47% in New Mexico. But the challenges continue. In the spring of 2023, the Biden administration declared an end to the COVID-19 related state of emergency in the United States. One of the consequences of this declaration was the end of enforcement of Title 42, the public health-related ordinance that allowed for easier removal of people crossing the border. Governor Abbott responded to the anticipated increase by requesting the assistance of other states through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which makes it easier for states to assist one another with resources in the wake of a disaster. 14 Republican-controlled states responded to the request, with Florida sending the most personnel at about 1,100. Activity along Fronton Island increased throughout 2023, and as part of Operation Lone Star, the Texas Land Commissioner, Dawn Buckingham, authorized the Department of Public Safety to patrol the area on September 7th. This paved the way for the raid the following month. The raid had recent precedent. 2 islands 90 miles to the northwest, near the Eagles Pass border crossing hotspot, were seized earlier by the Texas Department of Public Safety. Deterring illegal border crossings was the purpose behind the earlier raids, which gave the Texas Rangers operational experience in taking control of these small islands. On October 9th, the Texas Rangers launched their raid. Before doing so, they secured cooperation with their Mexican counterparts across the border, although doing this came with its own dangers. Seizing a series of structures built by the cartels was the first purpose of the raid. Doing so would restore operational control of Fronton Island to the state of Texas. Law enforcement on the island had been so lax that the cartels were marking these buildings with their symbols as their territory, and this was done for a reason. Fronton not only sits on the boundaries between the United States and Mexico, but on the border between the Gulf Cartel and the Cartel del Noreste, which has been allied to the Los Zetas cartel. The cartels therefore not only fought with American and Mexican law enforcement in the area, but with each other. To prove the point, some of the buildings were riddled with bullet holes from firefights between the rival cartels, and indeed, surveillance footage showed armed cartel personnel patrolling the island. The buildings were built on the island's high points to give the cartels an advantageous field of fire. The cartels were so brazen on the island that they at times fired on American law enforcement across the channel in the river. They shot at people on the southern side too. On September 9th, 2 days after Buckingham's authorization for the Texas Rangers to move on the island, a caravan of 20 people, 16 Mexicans and 4 Americans, came under attack near the island. 3 people were wounded in the incident. Essentially, this area in the United States territory was being militarized as part of the cartel's burgeoning narco polities extending from the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. This is one of the most dangerous areas in Mexico, and the US State Department has placed it on its do not travel list. That it sits right across the border is a demonstration of just how chaotic things are down there. Operation Lone Star sought to restore operational control of this dangerous island to the United States and the state of Texas. Governor Abbott ordered his state security services to take the island and hold it, come what may. To clear Fronton Island out, the Texas Rangers needed to conduct this operation in a highly militarized fashion. The men who took part in the raid looked like they could have been members of the regular US Army, as they wore full camouflage and body armor while carrying military-grade weapons. Nevertheless, the location of the island necessitated restrictive rules of engagement. The Rangers were not to fire upon anyone unless they were shot at first, for fear of sparking an international incident. Fortunately, the Rangers had the help of drones. The operation began with drone surveillance. This was likely far more effective than the helicopter surveillance of the island had been in 1983, thanks to higher resolution cameras, thermal imaging, and drones being far less detectable, although we're only making an educated guess about this. As noted, the Mexican Federal Police cooperated with the Rangers in the operation. Their task was to cut off entry to the island from the south bank of the Rio Grande. Unfortunately, because the cartels have infiltrated the machinery of the Mexican government at every level of administration and in every agency, the participation of Mexican law enforcement from their side of the Rio Grande likely meant that the cartels were tipped off about the Rangers' operation. The Rangers were undoubtedly aware of this, but nevertheless acted in a way to achieve maximum surprise. They began their raid at the crack of dawn. In another show of how dangerous the island had become, the Rangers needed to be wary not only of small arms fire coming from the elevated perches, but of improvised explosive devices. Officers warned their men not to disturb backpacks or piles of clothes for fear they might be booby-trapped. And indeed, law enforcement officers had once found an IED amid stashes of rifles and ammunition. Fortunately, the Rangers found nobody on the island during their raid. The cartel members who got wind of the operation decided to flee rather than put up a fight. The participating Rangers posed with the flag of Texas to send the message that they had retaken Fronton. However, this was only the first phase of the operation. The island had been recaptured. Now the state of Texas needed to effectively occupy it. The day after the raid, the National Guard and Texas Department of Public Safety began to fortify Fronton to prevent access to it from the Mexican side of the border. Once the Rangers declared the island to be clear of hostiles, the Texas National Guard began construction. These fortifications included over 1.5 miles of razor wire. The National Guard also began to clear the vegetation on the island. This act raised objections from a few quarters. The growth of fauna on Fronton Island had helped it to become a de facto wildlife sanctuary. Scientific experts also warned that clearing the island of vegetation would bring a local environmental disaster. Betty Perez, a local botanist, said of the plan, "That's what's holding these islands down, the vegetation. We're heading into times when there are big storms. That island will just sort of blow away, and then the silt will end up going down the river and causing more damage." Despite the danger, Texas officials were determined to continue clearing the vegetation on the island. Buckingham responded that the environmentalists should get a real concern and that securing Fronton was necessary for the state of Texas to achieve its goal of having complete operational control of the border. Patrols of the area continue, but because of a shortage of personnel and a vast border to patrol in far busier sectors, these will only have limited effectiveness. Texas's Operation Lone Star has also faced legal challenges, as immigration policy is constitutionally in the federal domain, not the state one. The clashes between the state and federal authority came to the forefront in January 2024, when agents from Texas and other states fortified Shelby Park in Eagle Pass in the same manner that they had fortified Fronton a few months earlier. The objective of this effort, according to Governor Abbott, was to protect the sovereignty of the state of Texas. Extensive razor wire barriers were constructed in the park to prevent illegal border crossings. The Biden administration immediately raised a legal challenge and demanded that Border Patrol agents regain access to the park in order to process the people who had crossed the border. A lower court ruling sided with Texas and prevented federal authorities from cutting the razor wire that Texas had set up. This ruling was later reversed in a 5-4 decision by the US Supreme Court, but the ruling was ambiguous. The feds were allowed to remove the fortifications in Eagle Pass, but the ruling did not say that Texas could not construct more of them. The standoff has therefore continued. This is why securing control of the border will be much harder for Texas to do than capturing an uninhabited island in the river, and the limitations of the raid on Fronton became clear shortly afterward. Drone and hidden ground camera footage released a month after the operation on Fronton Island revealed that squads of armed cartel members were patrolling the same border area. The cartels were no longer on the island, but there was no evidence that the raid had seriously damaged their ability to continue their illegal traffic, even in the same sector along the border. Indeed, other officials warned at the time of the raid that the cartels would simply move their activities elsewhere. This is certain, but depriving them of Fronton Island's tactical advantages and legal ambiguity was the right move. The cartels will certainly have another area from which to conduct their activities, but the alternative might not be as advantageous for them as Fronton was. The border crisis and all that comes with it shows no signs of abating. The Texas border with Mexico is over 1,200 miles long. Trying to stop illicit activity along such a stretch will always in some way be a game of whack-a-mole. The cartels can take advantage of this by rerouting their activities to places that are less heavily patrolled. There are also parts of the border that are nearly impossible to patrol in a systematic way thanks to natural obstacles. Meanwhile, the population centers on both sides of the border do not perfectly align with one another. A heavily populated area south of the border can act as an easy staging point for the cartels to smuggle their human and material cargoes across to a deserted part of the northern side that is physically hard to patrol or which has no infrastructure like border barriers. The best way to mitigate this is through cooperation with the Mexican authorities in the population center on the southern side, but that's not guaranteed. Even if it was, the cartel's infiltration of Mexico's security services will often mean that they will be tipped off in advance and reroute their activities, making it an imperfect solution at best. With these factors and legal challenges sure to continue against Operation Lone Star, Texas is in many ways behind the eight ball. Despite the success of the raid on Fronton, the crisis of organized crime on the US southern border won't end anytime soon. What do you think about the raid on Fronton Island and the broader Operation Lone Star effort? Is there a way for Texas to make its efforts more effective? Can the increased use of drones in the air and on water eventually become a game changer in the battle against the cartels? And what operation might Texas Rangers carry out next? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out what's stopping the US Army from attacking Mexican cartels. Or click this other video instead.
The United States has a serious drug problem, and it's bigger than you think, with the Chinese government strategically employing Mexican drug cartels as a pawn in its rivalry with the United States. This issue, if not faced head-on, will have geopolitical consequences that will extend well beyond the boundaries of the Western Hemisphere. Could the US military become the ultimate game-changer in this war? Let's find out. The opioid crisis has actually caused life expectancy within the country to decrease over the last few years, and fentanyl is one of the biggest reasons. This synthetic opioid is much more powerful than traditional drugs. The CDC estimates there were 100,306 drug overdose deaths in the United States between 2020 and 2021, up over 56,000 from the previous measuring period. The pandemic made the trend, which was already increasing, even worse. Fentanyl, originating in China and shipped north of the border by Mexican drug cartels, is responsible for many of these deaths. The crisis has led some American policymakers to consider declaring the Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs, which would subject them to military force. But what's stopping this from happening? Why hasn't the military taken part in active anti-narcotics operations in the past? What obstacles would such a mission face? And should the drug cartels south of the border be officially designated as FTOs? What range of options would the United States Armed Forces have to intervene? The Mexican drug cartels are vast criminal enterprises, so powerful that they sometimes compete with the government of Mexico itself for authority. Drugs, weapon smuggling, human trafficking, cybercrime, and kidnapping are all part of their plethora of illicit activities. They have their own territories that they govern as pseudo-narco states, subjecting the populations within their control to their wills, and they have made travel throughout the country much more dangerous for Mexican nationals and foreigners alike. In March 2023, after an attack on a group of American tourists visiting Mexico, which resulted in 2 deaths, a group of Republican United States senators led by Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, introduced legislation called the Ending the Notorious, Aggressive, and Remorseless Criminal Organizations and Syndicates Act, NARCOS. This bill would designate 9 Mexican drug cartels as FTOs. The designation would give American law enforcement agencies greater power to freeze their assets, deny their members entry into the United States, and increase penalties for those people who materially support these organizations. It would also give the United States military options to take part in counter-narcotics operations that it does not now have. Imagine a compound belonging to one of the Mexican drug cartels on Mexican soil. Then imagine a drone-launched Hellfire missile blowing the compound to kingdom come. This would be one such option should the US government officially designate the cartels as FTOs. Another possibility? Imagine the Rangers, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, or Delta Force conducting a targeted nighttime raid on that compound instead, almost like the attack on Osama bin Laden's compound in Pakistan in 2011. That would also be an option if the Mexican drug cartels were to get designated as FTOs by the United States government. The idea of using the military against the Mexican drug cartels has been a frequent topic of public discussion within the United States, but so far has not come to fruition. Why? Although the thoughts of America's best warriors bringing the cartels to justice are pleasant ones, many policymakers in Washington fear that should the U.S. military get further involved than its informal advisory role to law enforcement on drug-related matters, it would threaten the country's relationship with Mexico. For its part, the Mexican government has historical reasons to be concerned about the United States military involvement in its territory. The United States has militarily intervened in Mexico several times in the past. In the Mexican-American War between 1846 and 1848, the United States clawed vast tracts of territory from Mexico. In the resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States also used military force on Mexican soil while the latter country was in the throes of its revolution between 1910 and 1920. There, the U.S. Army was chasing Pancho Villa in a campaign lasting from 1916 to 1917. The Mexican government has reason to be jittery and fear that American military intervention within its borders could escalate into an outright invasion or a painful counterinsurgency campaign. And the Mexican government has other reasons to fear the cartels within their territory being listed as FTOs by the United States. Although it is unlikely that Mexico itself would ever be listed as a state sponsor of these organizations, the designation that there are FTOs operating within its territory would still make foreign governments and companies assess it as riskier to invest in. The designation would also hurt international tourism, which generates around $20 billion a year in Mexico and counts for about 8.5% of its GDP. Additionally, Mexico is a USMCA member with deep ties to American companies. In March 2023 alone, trade between the United States and Mexico reached $72.1 billion, an increase of 4.52% compared to March 2022. Trade between the two countries is about $750 billion annually. If the drug war escalates through American military intervention in Mexico, there is a risk for that trade to become disrupted, increasing supply chain problems and the resulting inflation that the American public has been dealing with for the past couple of years. The disruption of trade could worsen inflation in other ways too. Some of the United States' biggest exports to Mexico are energy products. These commodities include oil, gasoline, and liquefied natural gas. Such energy products fulfill a demand worth about $11 billion in March 2023 alone. If demand from Mexico for these products declines, the energy companies might be forced to raise prices on already existing customers to make up the shortfall, increasing Americans' energy bills. Mexico also exports vast quantities of commodities that the U.S. economy depends on, such as completed vehicles, personal and commercial, vehicle parts, computers, and medical equipment, among others. The economic consequences for disrupted trade on Mexico would be further reaching than inflation. The United States has dealt with an unprecedented border crisis since 2021, as millions of migrants have made the perilous journey north, with millions more expected in the months and years to come. If the United States military intervenes against the drug cartels and, as an unforeseen consequence, disrupts the trading network, say with the occasional errant drone strike, it will likely increase the amount of people coming north seeking replacement jobs. So, there are good reasons for the opposition to the designation of the drug cartels as FTOs by certain parts of Washington. In trying to solve one problem, it becomes important to not create others of equal or greater magnitude. Additionally, drug cartels do not set up shop in isolated compounds that are vulnerable to drone strikes or special operations forces. Most of the time, the drug cartel's infrastructure is less like the Osama bin Laden compound and more like the insurgents in Iraq. The cartels conduct their operations in the middle of cities and around a lot of commercial and civilian infrastructure. That's another reason why many policymakers and experts are concerned about the idea of American military intervention in Mexico. Imagine the headlines if civilians there get killed by a drone strike by mistake. Additionally, the Mexican drug cartels are known to use child soldiers as young as 11 years old. It is highly likely that these ruthless organizations would put these children on the front lines in such a confrontation with American troops. Such incidents would undermine the image of the United States as the world's humanitarian leader. All the same, the drug cartels are a serious and growing problem, with geopolitical implications that go far beyond the Western Hemisphere. As noted, the Mexican drug cartels are essentially being used as a cat's paw by the Chinese government in its competition with the United States. Since the fentanyl ingredients are manufactured in China, the Mexican drug cartels have become a tool of Chinese government policy. The Chinese military may not yet have the capability of withstanding a direct confrontation with its American counterpart, but if China can exert levers, which can lead to the deaths of thousands a year in the American homeland through this indirect channel, it has greater leverage in its negotiations with the United States. After then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in the summer of 2022, the world's attention fell to the Chinese military's massive exercises off the island that lasted for several days. However, for the American homeland, an announcement by the Foreign Ministry in the aftermath of Pelosi's visit was much more important. In it, the Chinese regime said it would suspend its cooperation with the United States on narcotics trafficking, including in fentanyl. Transnational crime was also an area that China announced its suspension of cooperation on. This announcement was a tacit admission from the regime that it would shy even further away from intervention against fentanyl dealers and their relationship with the Mexican drug cartels. As the Chinese regime controls the world's most sophisticated surveillance apparatus, it is highly unlikely that it's not fully aware of its domestic fentanyl industry. Fentanyl shipments to Mexico are therefore a conscious policy choice on the part of the Chinese government. The Chinese regime's drug policy is part of its overall approach to foreign policy. The Chinese Communist Party is still haunted by what it views as the century of humiliation, the years between 1839 and 1949, when China routinely suffered at the hands of foreign powers. China sees its fentanyl partly as revenge for the opium wars of the 1830s and 1840s, where the British Empire used military force to ensure it could sell its opium products into the Chinese market. The Chinese regime sees fentanyl not just as a way to make a profit, but part of a comprehensive, historically based foreign policy to ensure that it is strong and its opponents weak. The United States government can therefore not stand idly by, as the Mexican drug cartels are now an instrument of Chinese policy. They've become a player in the burgeoning great power rivalry between the United States and China. It is unsurprising that many policymakers in Washington are getting itchier to use a military response, especially since this tool of Chinese statecraft is so close to home. Removing these dangerous middlemen from the equation would also make China's destabilizing foreign policy more difficult for it to conduct. With fentanyl increasingly being disguised as candy and other things that could be enticing to children, it is clear that the problem is growing. The cartels themselves are also getting more sophisticated and powerful. For example, the Los Zetas cartel has recruited American soldiers as hitmen for their operations. Hundreds of thousands of people in Mexico work for these sprawling criminal empires, and many more benefit from the drug economy even when they're not involved with the criminal element. Los Zetas and the other cartels have also been building ever more sophisticated armored vehicles. These are not simply pickup trucks with light machine guns attached to their backs, but armored trucks and personnel carriers with sophisticated weapons like 50 caliber machine guns. Fortunately, the cartels have yet to equip themselves with explosive turrets atop their vehicles like a proper tank, but they have made use of grenade-dropping drones. The geopolitical consequences of the drug wars and the growing sophistication of the cartels mean that the policy responses of the past are no longer adequate to solve the crisis. A more proactive approach is needed, especially with the increasing militarization of the drug cartels and the personnel that work for them. The United States military's restriction to a law enforcement advisory role is by definition a reactive approach. So would there be alternative proactive approaches that would involve unleashing the might of the armed forces on the cartels, ones which might involve less damage to Mexico and with less risk of escalation or mission creep that could result in a grueling counterinsurgency style of warfare? 2 months before Graham and his co-sponsors introduced the Narcos Act, Congressman Dan Crenshaw, Republican from Texas, introduced the Declaring War on the Cartels Act of 2023. This legislation would increase the United States' ability to impose sanctions on foreign governments or other entities determined to have assisted the cartels or failed to have made adequate attempts to suppress them. Penalties would increase for individuals deemed to be accessories to cartel-related crimes, with mandatory 15-year additional prison sentences. Meanwhile, the law would require the Department of Homeland Security to create an apparatus to monitor efforts in countries deemed to be affected by cartel activity. The legislation would also loosen restrictions against U.S. military involvement in Mexico, but in a more careful way than if the cartels were designated as FTOs. Crenshaw said of that possibility, "It doesn't necessarily mean just dropping bombs right away. Diplomatically, it means that we have a whole new leverage over the government. The Mexican government does not like to deal with this problem. They like to ignore it. This is obviously a real war, and they obviously need our help, and we should have an authorization to allow that. I think this gives the president leverage, and I would think it would be a win." Leverage over Mexico would be secured, Crenshaw hopes, through the threat of military action against the cartels. The bill implies that if the Mexican government were to believe that a military response from the United States would happen, regardless of its involvement, it would be more amenable to cooperating in the effort rather than standing on the sidelines, forcing it out of its complacency to organized crime, which, as we'll see shortly, is deeply ingrained within Mexico's government and political culture. The approach championed by Crenshaw would see joint operations between the United States and Mexican militaries in a much harder line against the cartels, prompting the latter to go along with the new status quo. With Mexico involved in such operations, there is less of a chance for diplomatic misunderstandings or miscalculations. There would also be less chatter that the United States would be invading Mexico by using its military in anti-drug operations. Joint military cooperation between the two countries in anti-drug efforts would also reduce the likelihood of mission creep, a common problem in the United States military operations of the last 20 years. Supposedly limited interventions have led to decades worth of counterinsurgency operations, and the history of mission creep goes back much farther than the War on Terror. For example, American military intervention in the Mexican Revolution led to a campaign that eventually became an embarrassing debacle for the United States Army. Despite its initial victory, the last thing anyone wants is a similar 21st century campaign in Mexico. Close cooperation with the Mexican military, of the like that the Crenshaw approach favors, would make the possibility less likely. Unfortunately, the prospect of securing the cooperation of Mexico in this kind of escalation of the drug war is not guaranteed, and it brings with it its own dangers. The country has a corruption problem, and the Mexican government has ties with the cartels at every level and across every department. Critics have accused the Mexican army of giving the cartels a wide berth to conduct their operations, while it merely stands by and watches, at best patrolling the lines between the different cartels' territories and standing idly by as they embarked on their illegal activities only a few hundred yards away. The Mexican military had once taken a more proactive approach, but since the rise of Manuel López Obrador to the country's presidency, the government's policy toward the cartels has become less confrontational. Famously, Obrador said that his approach to pacify the drug cartels would involve hugs, not bullets. This was in response to earlier Mexican policy that had seen the use of military force, which did not always turn out splendidly. In 2019, Obrador, in response to one of the cartel's operations in the northern city of Culiacán, ordered the release of Ovidio Guzman, son of the infamous drug kingpin El Chapo, in an attempt to avoid further bloodshed. Unfortunately, the hugs not bullets policy has led to the passive policy of some Mexican army units we just talked about, and it raises questions about whether Congressman Crenshaw's approach to the problem would find cooperative ears south of the border. There would also be concerns that American operations and other sensitive information could actually be passed along to the cartels. In the middle of October 2022, a leak of more than 6.5 million documents exposed the deep corruption within the Mexican government and the military. A group of hackers going under the name Guacamaya released the data and showed numerous embarrassing examples of official malfeasance. For example, the governor of the Mexican state of Tabasco between 2019 and 2021, Adán Augusto López Hernández, put 3 known members of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel in powerful positions within the local security services. The result was, the cartel gained access to sensitive information and powerful military weapons. The hacked information also revealed that Mexican soldiers routinely sell weapons to the cartels, that law enforcement officials took bribes. One such official took $250,000 to protect the cartels, and that the military keeps detailed files on politicians and political activists rather than the members of the organized crime syndicates. Mayors throughout Mexico were also shown to have close links with the drug cartels. The documents also revealed corruption north of the border too. The influence of the cartels permeated among officials at all levels of government. One official in the United States was convicted of taking over $5 million in bribes from the cartels. Thousands of investigations have been conducted or are pending. President Obrador was dismissive of the hack, saying there's nothing that isn't known or shouldn't be known in the leaks. Unfortunately, the attempts at brushing over the problems fooled no one, and the corruption problems on both sides of the border leave the United States military in a bind should it attempt cooperation with its Mexican counterpart. Since corruption in Mexico goes high up the food chain of the defense ministry, there is a high likelihood that the cartels would be tipped off to at least some of the strikes or raids on their activities. Such leaks would put American soldiers in danger and increase the likelihood of American blood being spilled on Mexican soil. The risk of escalation and all the problems that come with it that we already went over would significantly increase at this point. For these reasons, there is a good possibility that Congressman Crenshaw's approach would fail. The more unilateral sudden strike approach of Graham and his co-sponsors becomes easier to justify when viewed in the light of Mexico's corruption problems involving the cartels. Indeed, sharing military knowledge and equipment with the Mexican military is all but asking for some of it to fall into the hands of the cartels. This was precisely how the Los Zetas cartel got its start. Designating Los Zetas and their peers as FTOs skips several steps and reduces the possibility that they will gain access to American equipment and secrets. Regardless of the United States military's role in the drug wars, it is likely that Washington will need to take more active measures against the Mexican cartels. The status quo is increasingly anathema to American interests, and these are not even the drug wars of 10 years ago. The entrance of fentanyl and the Chinese Communist Party into the equation changed things dramatically. Look for more legislative proposals from senators and congressmen to come in the near future, which will include the potential use of military force. But what do you think? Should the US military get involved in the war against drugs? In what way? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
America is losing the war on drugs. The opioid crisis threatens the very fabric of US society. In the past 25 years, an estimated 800,000 lives have been lost, and millions of others ripped apart by a cycle of addiction, poverty, crime, and premature death. In an article with UK newspaper The Guardian from January 2024, Dr. Art Van Zee said, "It didn't have to happen. There were so many missed opportunities, so many times it could have been stopped. Now, I don't see how it ends." If the country doesn't take decisive action, many of the communities worst affected might never conceivably recover. In an unprecedented move, President Joe Biden has called an emergency meeting with his Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin III and the heads of each branch of the military. Biden, like so many of his predecessors, knows exactly where these drugs are coming from and exactly who to target: Mexico and its infamous drug cartels. He knows he's reached the point of no retreat and that it's his responsibility to tackle the problem head-on, and that starts today. But why has the Biden administration decided to act now? Two reasons: fentanyl and China. In an interview back in May 2023, US Attorney General Merrick Garland called the Mexico-based Sinaloa cartel the largest, most violent, and most prolific fentanyl trafficking operation in the world. The drug itself, a synthetic opioid, is up to 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine, a truly chilling indication of exactly how deadly this drug can be. Various governmental agencies, including the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the military, have all tracked the cartel's supply chains and money laundering networks back to China. Even more troublingly, they've identified exactly where the ingredients to make one of the most addictive opioids on the planet have come from: the same country, China. However, an all-out assault on the Mexican drug cartels will be a tricky proposition to sell to both Congress and the American people. The economic ramifications alone could be disastrous. But when the president heard that fentanyl was being smuggled into the country disguised as candy, and that it could quite easily be mistaken as such by young children, he knew the time for talking had stopped. Hour 1. The meeting commences. The battle lines are drawn. Biden is in a prickly, confrontational mood. He paces up and down the Oval Office and informs Austin, General Charles Q. Brown Jr., Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Christopher W. Grady, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Randy A. George, Chief of Staff of the Army, General Christopher J. Mahoney, Acting Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Admiral Lisa M. Franchetti, Chief of Naval Operations, of his plan of action. Folks, with your help, we're going to wreck the Mexican drug cartels once and for all. We're going to launch an attack so devastating and precise that we will shatter their operations completely. George is the first to express his surprise. Like the other top military officials in attendance, he presumed this was no more than a standard briefing. What do you mean exactly, Mr. President? Just what I said. We're going to strike at the drug cartels in their own backyards, and we're going to put them out of commission within the next 24 hours. The room becomes a hive of activity, argument, counter-argument, and hypotheses. But Biden has already put Port Huachuca, the nearest U.S. military base to the Mexican border, on high alert. Situated in Cochise County, Arizona, the complex has a population of about 6,500 active-duty soldiers. Only in recent weeks, that number has swelled exponentially, and the site has been the scene of top-secret military operations. Additional troops and military hardware have been covertly delivered to the base in preparation for a surprise attack on the drug cartels. Over the next 45 minutes, Biden and his team draw up a two-pronged attack. Firstly, the four biggest cartels will be targeted by systematic drone strikes. Not that this will be a wholly straightforward part of the mission. The drug-making and distribution facilities identified by U.S. intelligence are situated in different parts of the country, in some cases hundreds of kilometers apart. The Sinaloa Cartel in the northwest, the Jalisco Cartel, mainly in the Tierra Caliente region, the Gulf Cartel in the northeast, centered around the border state of Tamaulipas, and the Los Zetas Cartel, also in the same northeasterly region. But sir, says Randy, our drones don't have that kind of range to hit targets that far away from Huachuca. As a result, we'll never be able to coordinate the kind of synchronized attacks you talked about. That's when Biden reveals his ace card: the Mexican government. Since 2006, the country declared its own war on the cartels. 360,000 citizens have been victims of drug-related homicide. Despite partnering closely with the US, receiving billions of dollars to modernize its security forces, reform its judicial system, and fund development projects to curb migration, no real or lasting progress has been made. Ultimately, Washington hoped to stem the flow of illegal drugs into the country by bolstering security and monitoring operations along the border, but to no avail. Like his American counterpart, Mexican leader Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO as he's called in the popular press, knows that the time for empty rhetoric and procrastination is well and truly over. It's time to act. In maneuvers just as covert, Mexican military hardware and troops have been gathering in the northwest and northeast of the country. Unbeknown to the drug cartels, they are now under round-the-clock surveillance and are about to be subject to a devastating attack, the likes of which have rarely, if ever, been seen before. Secondly, and decisively, ground troops then swarm on each of the targeted cartel facilities to ensure that they have all been put out of operational use and that the key figures in the Mexican drug trade have either been killed or captured. We've done this before, the president says. Think Bin Laden in Pakistan, and don't kid yourselves in any way, shape or form. This operation is of similar importance to the American people. But sir, says Brown, much of the cartel infrastructure is based in cities or towns, built-up areas with a high concentration of civilians. Military action of this nature would result in a potentially huge loss of life, collateral damage that will be hard to justify, no matter how worthy the cause. Risky it might be, but Biden knows he has to bring down the Mexican drug cartels as quickly as he plans. Ultimately, it would give him the kind of political leverage that might just see him cling onto the keys of the White House in the upcoming elections. Make no mistake, Biden is staking his political legacy on the success of this operation. Let's proceed as planned. Let's do some good, people. Hour 2. Fort Huachuca has been put on a state of high alert. Personnel are now priming the Hellfire missiles on squadrons of drones, which will shortly be launched against the drug facilities within range. Each drone will be armed with the AGM-114 Hellfire air-to-surface missile, ASM. Originally designed for anti-armor use, they were later developed for precision drone strikes against other target types, especially high-value targets, just like the drug manufacturing facilities in Mexico. This multi-mission, multi-target precision strike ability means that the missiles can be launched from multiple air, sea, and ground platforms, making Fort Huachuca the perfect location to initiate the surprise attack. To ensure optimal devastation, the drones will be launched in mini-squadrons of 20 in number. When in range, the laser-guided AGM-114L longbow Hellfire missiles will be deployed. Nothing within the vicinity is likely to survive a direct hit. Hour 6. the first wave of drones is launched. In a series of well-coordinated attacks, the Hellfire missiles successfully target the drug cartel infrastructure, decimating dozens of buildings and reducing whole streets to nothing more than dust and rubble. Reports from Mexican troops on the ground paint a picture of utmost carnage and chaos. Whole neighborhoods have been leveled. Dead bodies are strewn across the blood-soaked streets. Fires rage, sirens wail. Not that there is much that the paramedics who arrive at the scene can do for those maimed and seriously injured. Reports of thousands of casualties from each town and city are starting to reach media outlets across Mexico and beyond. The attacks are devastating and effective. One cartel after another has been effectively wiped off the face of the earth. But at what cost? Like Brown had predicted back at the Oval Office, the cartels are far from stupid. They deliberately operate out of big cities and towns he mentioned in heavily built-up areas to nullify the possibility of such an attack. They know that no government could initiate a full-blown offensive if the loss of innocent lives would be so high. Biden has called their bluff. The sudden nature and ferociousness of the attacks have taken the cartels by surprise. For that reason, they have suffered irrecoverable losses, both in terms of manpower, infrastructure, and product. While the drug manufacturing facilities may have been primitive, they were incredibly effective, with some working around the clock. Billions of dollars of refined opioids destined for the American market have been destroyed. Great chemical clouds of smoke hang over the site of each decimated building. Visibility is negligible, and the air is barely breathable. Round 1 to Biden and the Mexican government. Hour 12. Heavy artillery moves in on the ground. Mexican AMX-13, T-55 and T-72 tanks and hundreds of troops, ably supported by US Rangers, Green Berets, Marine or Delta Force regiments, aim to secure each targeted area and ensure that any hostile threat has been neutralized. At first, this appeared to be no more than a reconnaissance mission, with troops confirming that different sectors of different towns and cities were safe and reporting back to their superiors, but that didn't prove to be the case. As each unit picked its way through the rubble, they met with incredible and unforeseen resistance. Although fully unprepared for the attack, the surviving cartel members have somehow managed to galvanize themselves into a scattered fighting force. Equipped with armored trucks with 50 caliber machine guns and their own grenade-dropping drones, the severely depleted forces scramble to launch wave after wave of attack. As a result, the Mexican and US troops have to dig in and take defensive positions. With far superior manpower and resources, they see this as the only momentary setback and fully expect to continue their advance in due course. However, as US snipers get into position and begin to return fire, they soon realize that they are shooting at no more than heavily armed children. "Sir," one of the commanding officers reports back to base, "we have a slight problem on the ground here and need some clarification from our superiors before proceeding with the mission." For the drug cartels, no tactic, however preposterous or underhand, is off the table. They have routinely used child soldiers as young as 11 to further their operational goals. Whether patrolling the drug-making facilities or intimidating the local populace, kids who should rightly have been playing in parks are now toting semi-automatic weapons and tossing grenades at one of the most advanced armies in the world. The killing of children, even in a war against drugs, wouldn't look good for Biden in an election year. When the president is made aware of the fact in the White House Situation Room, he sits in studied silence for a full minute, maybe more. He no doubt visualizes the headlines in the morning papers and hears the bulletins on all the major news channels, but he's gone too far to pull out now. Ever since he took office, he's read one report after another enumerating the drug-related deaths directly attributable to the Mexican cartels. He knows it's a cliché, and he knows that it may well not save his job, but in some situations, tough decisions simply have to be made. In some situations, as inhumane as it may sound, the ends really do justify the means. "Continue with the mission," he informs his staff. "Let's get this thing done and dusted today." Hour 18. Having slowly but surely overcome the fierce resistance on the ground, Mexican and US troops have now secured each and every sector of each and every targeted area. Of the few local people who survived the first drone onslaught, then the ground assault, they stagger from the remnants of the decimated buildings, bloodied and beaten, and either waving improvised white flags or raising their hands in surrender. As the medical teams rush over to assist them, one word in Spanish resonates above all others: gracias. As much as the troops are moved by this simple gesture, as much as they realize that they've contributed to removing these people from out under the tyranny of the drug cartels, it's a bittersweet victory. So many victims, many of them children, are testament to the true cost of the operation. Hour 24. Biden calls a press conference at the White House. In the James S. Brady press briefing room, the president informs an unexpected world of the news that the US, in cooperation with the Mexican government, launched a bold and decisive attack at the very heart of the Mexican drug cartels. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. We finally got him. The press contingent looks on in confusion. None have been briefed regarding the true nature and scale of the operation. Shortly after I came into office, Biden continues, I read a report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Do you know how many deaths were directly linked to the illegal opioids that have flooded into our country from Mexico? Well, let me tell you, 100,306. No more. We've just taken a huge step in finally winning the war on drugs. Biden is seen as a hero and his actions lauded across the globe. Of course, this scenario is just one of many ways the US military could potentially wreck the Mexican drug cartels. In reality, however, the American government would face many legal problems in launching any such attack, not to mention fierce opposition in Congress. Firstly, they would have to redefine the status of the drug cartels through the US courts, but this could conceivably be overcome in quite a straightforward manner. By designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, Biden would be legally entitled to deploy military force to overcome the drug problems posed by Mexico. This may not be the most popular or welcome of moves, though. If the drug cartels were designated as FTOs, it would have a potentially crippling effect on the Mexican economy. Some experts estimate that it could hit the tourist sector to the tune of $20 billion, or 8.5% of its GDP. Why? Quite simply, people would be scared of traveling to a country riddled with terroristic elements. Other economic arguments are just as compelling. Trade between the US and Mexico alone is worth $72.1 billion. Eye-watering figures that illustrate exactly how much is at stake here. But at what point does the social cost of the opioid crisis in the US outweigh the economic ramifications of war on the Mexican drug cartels? We've already provided some chilling statistics at the top of the video, but perhaps it pays to dig deeper to paint an even starker picture of the crisis. As mentioned earlier in the video, both countries are well aware of the scale of the issue and the human cost involved in the opioid crisis, even if, historically, the US has been reluctant to intervene militarily to not worsen its already shaky relationship with Mexico. Inherent issues which can be traced back to the Mexican-American War of 1846–48. With the other conflicts that are raging around the world at present, most notably Russia's brutal attempts to annex Ukraine, López Obrador may fear a similar fate. But any notion of the US carving up the country and taking over is, of course, mere conjecture. What can't be denied are the many legal rumblings that have taken place in recent years. Following the death of US nationals in Mexico, Senator Lindsey Graham, co-sponsored by Senators John Kennedy, Marsha Blackburn, Josh Hawley, Steve Daines, Mike Lee, and Mike Brown, introduced the Ending the Narcos Act of 2023 to the United States Senate, or to give it its full name, Ending the Notorious, Aggressive, and Remorseless Criminal Organizations and Syndicates Act. Following on from a previous point, the purpose of this act was to designate Mexican cartels and other transnational criminal organizations as FTOs. The reasoning behind this is that these organizations pose significant threats to US citizens due to their involvement in acts of terrorism, including the production and importation of illicit substances such as fentanyl. Again, the ultimate aim was to enable the US to tackle this threat with the kind of extreme military force described earlier in the video. And it would be remiss not to mention the migrant crisis. Everyone remembers Donald Trump's infamous Build a Wall speech from his successful presidential campaign back in 2016. In a BBC report from 2022, there were a record 239,416 encounters between illegal migrants and US law enforcement at the Mexico border. And while Biden has attempted to address the issue by offering legal status to an estimated 11 million undocumented people in the US, his proposal failed to gain enough bipartisan support to pass into law. Conservative critics have been outraged by what they see as being soft on the border. And the figures back this up, with a significant spike in number during Biden's term in office, something which could prove critical if, as expected, he faces off against Trump again in the upcoming election. And if all that wasn't bad enough, there's an even more sinister geopolitical subplot to our story: China. As highlighted earlier, Beijing is known to be supplying the ingredients that make up fentanyl to the Mexican drug cartels. The natural question is why? What does China get out of aiding and abetting criminal organizations? Instability, thousands of deaths each year, a general weakening of the social structure across vast swathes of America. The list could go on. But there is historical precedence, if not a justification, for China's stance here. The country sees fentanyl as revenge for what it calls the century of humiliation and the opium wars of the 1830s and 40s. These kinds of tactics, therefore, can be seen as a historically based foreign policy to ensure that China remains strong and its enemies weak. Case in point, China had suspended cooperation with the United States on drug policies in 2023, but agreed to resume bilateral cooperation in January 2024. Undoubtedly, there's a much bigger picture here to consider, one that would take up one, if not several more videos to cover in its entirety. But if there is one underlying factor that's stopping the US from deploying military force against the Mexican drug cartels, it's the dreaded possibility of mission creep. In so many conflicts of recent years, and we can go back to Vietnam and beyond, the US has deployed forces in a region for what it initially saw as a short-term basis to achieve its military aims, be that to stabilize a country or gain a geopolitical foothold in a region crucial to US interests abroad. All too often, this has led to years of attritional fighting, and in the case of Vietnam and Afghanistan, embarrassing and costly withdrawals, with the country in question being in a much worse situation than it was before. The last thing Biden or whoever happens to occupy the White House in the future wants is a long, drawn-out, painful, bloody war in Mexico. For that reason alone, any military action against the drug cartels is highly unlikely now or in the short to medium term. Just quite how the US solves the opioid crisis and gains an upper hand in the war on drugs remains to be seen. But perhaps the words of former Guatemalan leader Otto Perez Molina, a paraphrase from a famous Albert Einstein quote, sums up the situation most succinctly. We cannot continue doing the same thing and expect different results. Now we're coming to the end of the video, and it's time to ask you what you think about the opioid crisis in America and how the government should respond. Do you think the problem is so serious that some kind of military intervention is inevitable? Or do you think the economic factors highlighted in this video make military action all but impossible? And what of the bigger geopolitical picture? Can the US sit back as China floods its towns and cities with highly addictive substances like fentanyl? It's certainly a tough call for whoever will be sitting in the White House come November, but sadly, it's not a problem that's going to go away on its own. If America doesn't act now, it may well be counting the cost for generations to come. Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out what's stopping the US Army from attacking Mexican cartels, or click this other video instead.
Mexico isn't exactly a stranger to cartels. For over 50 years, those shadowy organizations have ruled the Mexican underworld, often extending their influence into politics, economics, and everyday life. The cartels have always ruled with an iron fist, using a combination of intimidation, violence, and bribery to maintain their power and control. But the kind of violence earlier Mexican cartels turned to was typically focused on just that, maintaining control over drug trafficking routes and territories. These acts, while brutal, were often more strategic, aimed at asserting dominance rather than spreading terror indiscriminately. This all changed with the rise of the Los Zetas. This cartel practically reinvented the notion of brutality, employing tactics that shocked even the most hardened observers. Los Zetas performed paramilitary-style executions. They tortured their victims in the most horrific ways and posted videos of the torture online, beheaded them and mounted their heads on spikes in urban areas, hung their bodies from bridges, created one mass grave after another filled with immigrants, students, and many other innocent victims. Their ruthlessness and willingness to commit such atrocities quickly set them apart from other cartels, earning them a reputation as the most deadly and feared criminal organization in Mexico and beyond. But Los Zetas' brutality wasn't the only thing that set them apart. Unlike traditional cartels formed by drug traffickers, Los Zetas were formed by elite Mexican Special Forces soldiers, deserters from the Mexican army. Trained in military tactics and warfare, they brought a level of organization previously unseen in the world of Mexican cartels. This made them nothing short of a nightmare for the Mexican police and military, who were often outmatched and even outgunned by Los Zetas' highly trained operatives. Eventually, however, they did manage to beat them, as Los Zetas fell from power almost as quickly as they rose. So how did they manage to do it? What did the war with Mexico's most fearsome and notorious cartel look like? Stick around and find out. But to fully understand the downfall of Los Zetas, you must first learn about their rise to power and the military-style modus operandi that made them stand out so much. After all, we're talking about an organization that even the US government described as the most technologically advanced, sophisticated, and dangerous cartel in Mexico. So how did Los Zetas come to be? Los Zetas actually started as an elite unit of bodyguards. They were formed by Arturo Guzman de Sena, a member of the Air Mobile Special Forces Group, or GAFE for short, an elite division of the Mexican military. Sometime after joining the GAFE, Guzman was recruited by the Gulf Cartel, a major drug trafficking organization at the time. In the beginning, he only took bribes from the cartel's head, Osiel Cardenas Guillen, to help him turn a blind eye to all the drug shipments. However, in 1997, Guzman defected from the GAFE to work for the cartel full-time as Guillen's bodyguard. He quickly earned Guillen's trust, executing his daughter's godfather and Guillen's longtime business partner without a moment's notice when ordered. But the situation in the Gulf Cartel wasn't particularly great at the time. Guillen's fear that he might lose control made him increasingly paranoid. It also led to the conclusion that one elite bodyguard wasn't enough. He needed a whole unit, his own private army, if you will. And what better way to find these elite bodyguards than to go straight to the source, the Mexican army? As a former soldier, Guzman was in charge of recruiting these bodyguards. Through careful negotiation, he managed to convince at least 31 men to desert the army, most of whom came from his previous unit, the GAFE. And so, an elite paramilitary private army was formed to protect Guillen and do his bidding. The army was named Los Zetas, which literally translates to the Z's. The name refers to Guzman, as his Federal Judicial Police radio code as a high-ranking officer was Z1. Each subsequent member of importance received a Z designation, followed by the number that indicated their rank within the organization. Los Zetas weren't some pistol-toting gang members with shaved heads and tattoos. No, they were highly trained soldiers who could kill in cold blood. Interestingly, the training in question actually came from the US for some of Los Zetas. How is this possible? Well, you see, the GAFE soldiers were sent to the U.S. to be trained by the 7th Special Forces Group, an elite operational unit of the U.S. Army Special Forces stationed at Fort Liberty, North Carolina. Fort Liberty, or Fort Bragg as the military installation was known at the time, was precisely where GAFE soldiers received their training in the early 1990s. But what kind of training are we talking about? The 7th Special Forces Group is designed to deploy and execute 9 doctrinal missions. Number 1, unconventional warfare. Number 2, foreign internal defense. Number 3, direct action. Number 4, counterinsurgency. Number 5, special reconnaissance. Number 6, counterterrorism. Number 7, information operations. Number 8, counterproliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And number 9, security force assistance. Future Los Zetas received the standard Special Forces training, learning to read maps and handle light to heavy weapons, machine guns, and automatic weapons. However, their training was primarily focused on counterinsurgency and counter-narcotics operations. Nothing if not ironic, given how Los Zetas went on to use those skills obtained at Fort Liberty. Now, the U.S. Special Forces training Los Zetas to be was nothing new or special. Military forces from around the world were sent to Fort Liberty to train from the best. After all, Special Forces soldiers are known for their ability to slip into enemy territory, live off the land, and execute enemies once the right conditions are met. That's why it shouldn't be surprising that many experts believe that the specific skills learned from the 7th Special Forces Group primed Los Zetas for their careers as contract killers. And they weren't even taught the most advanced commando techniques at Fort Liberty. Given how ruthless and efficient they became with just the standard training, there's no telling the level of devastation they could have inflicted with advanced training. Though not all Los Zetas had the chance to learn from the U.S. Special Forces directly, they were given the necessary training by those who did. Los Zetas set up training camps where they passed on their knowledge to the new recruits, as well as some former federal, state, and local police officers. Later on, as the number of U.S.-trained soldiers in their ranks shrunk, they hired some 30 Caibiles to train new recruits. The Caibiles are a special operations unit under the Armed Forces of Guatemala, specializing in jungle warfare tactics and counterinsurgency operations. The training camps where these recruits were turned into cold-blooded killing machines were set up similarly to the GAFE training facilities. It was precisely their training that ensured that Los Zetas had an impressively high operational success rate. Since Los Zetas trained like soldiers, they fought like soldiers too. This meant fighting in military-like units which operated semi-autonomously. Each unit has a regional commander, while the overall leadership structure was highly decentralized. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about these units was how they seized areas of interest. Los Zetas would practically invade an area just like an army would. They would move in and hold the territory using brutality to establish and maintain control. This approach allowed them to diversify their activities, getting into local drug dealing, racketeering, stealing cars, and selling pirated goods. Essentially, Los Zetas managed to control every inch of the seized territory and every business taking place in it, and that's how organized and efficient they were. Besides this impressive organization, Los Zetas picked up another thing from the military: the strict code of unwavering loyalty and rigid discipline. Dissent was dealt with rather brutally, which is pretty ironic given how Los Zetas were formed in the first place. The cartel even introduced military-style medals to recognize those among them who followed these principles. The Los Zetas Commando Medallion was made out of gold and silver, featured a prominent Z on the front, and was awarded to Los Zetas troops who did the cartel proud. Of course, doing Los Zetas proud involved nothing short of unspeakable brutality. However, extreme ruthlessness wasn't all the Los Zetas were known for. They were also known for their massive firepower. So massive that the largest weapon seizure in Mexico's history was made possible precisely by Los Zetas' arsenal, and of course Operation Blackjack. Under this operation, the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, worked together to identify 3 safe houses in Mexico owned by Los Zetas. Then, the Mexican Federal Security Forces raided these houses, finding over 40 kidnapped individuals and a barrage of weapons and military equipment. The seized assets included 540 rifles, including 288 assault rifles and several .50 caliber rifles, 287 hand grenades, 2 M72 Law anti-tank weapons, a rocket launcher, 500,000 rounds of ammunition, 1,000 magazines, 67 ballistic vests, 3 anti-aircraft weapons, 14 sticks of dynamite. That's more weapons than an average U.S. police department has in its arsenal. Los Zetas' training, discipline, organization, and firepower combined allowed them to up the ante of violence among the cartels. These operatives were guided by a simple premise: frighten your enemy enough and you might defeat them without a fight. This type of psychological warfare allowed Los Zetas to compete with the already established cartels of the time. Unlike those cartels, Los Zetas didn't focus on buying alliances. Instead, they terrorized them. Though, to be fair, they still had to grease a palm here and there. For instance, a former Zeta boss, Karim Munoz Castillo, known by his alias Commandant Kalim, revealed that he was paying over $20,000 to corrupt police officers in northern Veracruz. Similarly, another former Zeta, Hector Moreno Villanueva, revealed that the cartel infiltrated the Mexican military so much that they would always get a heads up when soldiers were coming to their area to search their premises or make arrests. That's what made combating Los Zetas particularly challenging for the Mexican state, as you'll hear later on in the video. Another challenge in putting an end to this horrific organization was the sheer level of brutality they were capable of. To make matters worse, other Mexican cartels were forced to ramp up the violence if they wanted to have any chance to preserve their territories or their operations. After all, they were dealing with a cartel known to cook people alive. That's why Los Zetas are credited with increasing the brutality and violence involved in the modern Mexican drug wars, forever altering the cartel landscape in Mexico. To understand just how brutal Los Zetas were, let's do a quick recap of some of the most atrocious crimes they've committed, many of which were way worse than any horror movie you could imagine. This overview will also give you a glimpse into what the war against Los Zetas looked like in Mexico. All the most horrifying attacks carried out by Los Zetas took place after they split from the Gulf Cartel and began an independent operation. The first among them is the San Fernando Massacre, which was discovered on August 24, 2010. A few days before the discovery, a group of 72 immigrants, mainly from Central and South America, was traveling through Tamaulipas, where Los Zetas was based. The group was headed for the U.S. border when it was surrounded and cut off by Los Zetas. The cartel initially asked for ransom, but since the group didn't have enough money, they were asked to work as hitmen for Los Zetas and received $1,000 every 15 days. All of the immigrants, 58 men and 14 women, refused the offer. So they were taken to a nearby warehouse, put on their knees against the wall, and shot in the back of their heads, one by one. One Ecuadorian immigrant managed to survive after the bullet struck him in the neck, not the head. Still, he played dead until Los Zetas operatives left the area. Then he traveled almost 14 miles before he happened to cross a military checkpoint. There, he told the Mexican Marines what had happened. At first, he wasn't believed. How is this possible? Well, the cartels were no strangers to using similar ploys to ambush and execute police and military officers. Eventually, the Mexican authorities realized the man's story was true and launched a search operation. They descended on the Tamaulipas ranch via air and ground and were met with a rain of bullets fired by Los Zetas present at the ranch. These Los Zetas were so heavily armed and guarded that the officers had no choice but to retreat after a whole day of shootings. The next day, the Mexican military armed itself with additional troops and weapons and stormed the ranch. This time, no one was there to meet them. Well, no one except the 70 or so handcuffed and blindfolded bodies of poor immigrants who were slaughtered by Los Zetas. Besides the bodies, the military recovered 21 rifles, 101 ammunition clips, 4 bulletproof vests, and 4 vehicles. One of these vehicles was even a replica of the trucks used by the Mexican naval infantry. The next large-scale massacre was discovered not even a year later at the same place, earning it the name of the Second Massacre of San Fernando. This time, the Mexican authorities weren't tipped off by a survivor. Instead, they noticed that numerous suitcases belonging to bus passengers in Tamaulipas weren't being claimed. The authorities launched an immediate investigation, which led them to the La Jolla Ranch in the San Fernando municipality. What they found at the ranch was even more horrific than the previous massacre. At first, they exhumed 59 corpses from 8 unmarked mass graves. Within the following 2 months, these figures rose to 193 bodies and 47 total mass graves. The bodies belonged to the passengers who were kidnapped after their buses were hijacked along the Mexican Federal Highway 101. But before they were killed, they were tortured in the most horrific ways. The women were raped. The men were forced to fight to the death with the other hostages using knives, machetes, clubs, and hammers. And those who managed to survive and kill the other hostages were recruited for Los Zetas. The sheer horror of the second massacre of San Fernando prompted the Mexican government to take drastic measures. The military immediately deployed 650 soldiers to San Fernando, establishing a military base in the region. The troops stationed in San Fernando took over local police duties, focusing on restoring peace to the beleaguered municipality. The peace in question involved arresting over 80 Los Zetas in less than 3 months. The only attack that claimed more lives than the second massacre of San Fernando took place that same year, a month before the first San Fernando victims were discovered. This attack is also notable, as it demonstrates just how far-reaching Los Zetas' influence was, even among the Mexican federal police officers vetted by the DEA. What happened is that the DEA managed to persuade a high-ranking Zeta operative to reveal the trackable cell phone identification numbers of 2 of the cartel's most wanted leaders. Once it obtained the information, the DEA shared it with the Mexican federal authorities. Unsurprisingly, this information quickly got around to Miguel Angel Trevino and his brother Omar, the very people whose cell phone ID numbers were compromised. Again, unsurprisingly, the brothers didn't take this information very well. They set out to exact revenge on the people who betrayed them and anyone even remotely connected to them. For the diabolical brothers, this meant killing between 300 and 500 people in the quaint ranching town of Allende, some 1.5 miles away from Eagle Pass, Texas. No mercy was shown on that fateful day in March 2011, with men, women, and children killed, homes demolished, and entire blocks left in ruin. The Allende massacre clearly showed that Los Zetas had the Mexican authorities in the palm of their hands. To understand just how much Los Zetas weren't fazed about the Mexican police, all you need to know is that they weren't afraid to conduct attacks in broad daylight. This brings us to the next atrocity in Los Zetas' long list of horrors, the 2011 Monterrey casino attack. After the casino owners refused to pay protection money to the cartel, 12 Zeta troops stormed the establishment in the middle of the day and set it on fire, killing 52 civilians. The Mexican forces arrived only a few minutes after the fire was started, but it took them several hours before they demolished the walls of the casino and retrieved the bodies. As a response to this horrific attack, 3,000 soldiers were sent to Monterrey, while the rest of Nuevo León was patrolled by armored units and US-made Black Hawk helicopters. At the time, the attack was classified as the bloodiest in the history of the city of Monterrey and one of the most violent in the state of Nuevo León. Unfortunately, after only a year, another bone-chilling attack in the same state would almost eclipse this brutality: the Cadereyta Jimenez massacre. During this massacre, 49 people were decapitated and mutilated by Los Zetas, who then dumped their bodies along the Mexican Federal Highway 40. The victims were reportedly members of the rival Sinaloa Cartel, an organization originally headed by the infamous Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. After the discovery, the highway was blocked by federal agents and state police officers for over 7 hours, with an additional 50 police officers deployed to secure the municipality of Cadereyta. But was that all the Mexican authorities did in this brutal war against Los Zetas, only react after a massacre was committed? Absolutely not. The Mexican authorities actively employed the so-called decapitation strategy pioneered by former Mexican President Felipe Calderón, who is also credited with starting the Mexican drug war. The decapitation strategy focused on targeting and locating the top leaders of the cartels and either capturing or killing them. The goal was to destabilize or dismantle the group altogether. Unfortunately for Mexican forces, Los Zetas proved to be rather adept at absorbing losses and continuing their operations as if nothing happened. This primarily had to do with their military training and decentralized leadership approach. Even worse, this was only one of the challenges to the militarized crackdown of Los Zetas, a cartel that's remembered as incredibly difficult to disrupt. Other challenges included the group's training itself. Remember, these individuals were trained on how to defeat insurgencies, and trained by U.S. elite soldiers no less. This allowed them to successfully evade many of the tactics used by the Mexican forces. Next, Los Zetas had people in virtually every police and military unit, as the Allende massacre demonstrated. Thanks to this, they escaped capture on many occasions, as well as disrupted law enforcement operations from within. And finally, the sheer ruthlessness and willingness to use extreme violence made Los Zetas a nearly insurmountable foe. Most Mexican police officers were simply ill-equipped to face such a merciless adversary. This mismatch in capability often resulted in catastrophic outcomes for law enforcement, further complicating efforts to dismantle the cartel. And yet, these efforts persisted until they finally paid off, until Los Zetas were no more, at least in their original paramilitary formation. To achieve this outcome, the Mexican authorities had to take out one Zetas leader after another. Today, almost all of the original 21 Zetas have been either captured or killed. With this in mind, here's an overview of how the police and military operations accomplished the task. The original Zeta, Arturo Guzman de Sena, or Z1, was also the first to be killed by the military. He was shot to death with over 50 bullets in 2002, after Mexican soldiers were tipped off that he was in a restaurant in Matamoros, Tamaulipas. Rogelio González Pizania, Z2, took over Los Zetas after Guzman's death, but he was captured some 2 years later by the members of the former federal preventive police officers as well as federal agents. Next in line, Heriberto Lascano, or Z3, managed to evade authorities much longer. This shouldn't be surprising given he was known as the executioner within the organization, a nickname he earned through sheer brutality and cold calculation. He was eventually taken out by the Mexican Navy on October 7, 2012. At that point, the control over Los Zetas passed to Miguel Ángel Trevino. If you remember, Trevino was one of the two brothers involved in the Allende massacre. Interestingly, Trevino wasn't among the initial members of Los Zetas, hence his Z40 code name. However, he managed to quickly rise up through the ranks with sheer brutality and ruthlessness. Reportedly, he was the one who oversaw both the first and second San Fernando massacres. But it's important to note that Trevino was also the first Zeta commander who didn't come from a military background. He was nothing more than a drug trafficker with an incredibly violent nature. Unsurprisingly, this marked a massive shift in the Los Zetas operations. The violence was still as intense as ever, but the group's organization and military discipline slowly started to erode. And when the discipline broke down, the infighting began. Naturally, Mexican authorities used this to their advantage. In July 2013, the Mexican Marine Corps managed to capture Trevino, once again decapitating Los Zetas. He was intercepted near Nuevo León while riding with two Zeta lieutenants in a pickup truck. This capture was carried out without a single bullet fired. After being detained by the Marine Corps via helicopter, the Zetas in the pickup truck were arrested by ground troops who arrived as support. This swift operation was the result of a several-month-long surveillance operation. When capturing Trevino, the authorities also retrieved 8 guns and $2 million in cash. Trevino was reportedly replaced by his brother Omar, or Z42, but he too was captured relatively quickly in March 2015. After the capture of both Trevino brothers, the Los Zetas lost most of their power and territory, getting replaced by Jalisco Cartel New Generation, the new violent cartel in Mexico. During the last few months of Los Zetas supremacy, the Mexican authorities were scoring one victory after another. In October 2013, they captured a reported top Zeta operative, Gerardo Jaramillo, whose arrest led to the discovery of a massive weapons cache. Mexican authorities seized assault rifles, grenade launchers, magazines, and around 4,000 rounds of ammunition of various calibers. In May 2014, the Mexican security forces took out Galindo Mellado Cruz, aka Z11, after raiding his hideout in the city of Reynosa. In March 2015, a potential successor of Z-42, Ramiro Perez Moreno, was detained by Mexican Marines in the state of Tamaulipas. He was traveling in an SUV which also contained 4 more Zetas, as well as 4 assault rifles, a fragmentation grenade, and cartridges. The Mexican authorities continued persecuting Los Zetas even after their, quote, downfall, ensuring the organization can never reach the level of influence and terror it once had. It was precisely this ongoing commitment in the wider context of the Mexican drug war that put an end to one of the most brutal and resilient cartels in modern history. However, this has in no way ended the cartel violence in Mexico. In fact, this violence only seems to be intensifying. By 2023, it had already been 6 years since Mexico hit the 30,000 murders mark, thus making it one of the most violent periods in the country's recent history. Now let us pass the question over to you. Is there a way to truly stop the Mexican cartels? And what do you think of Los Zetas, the cartel that single-handedly contributed to the rise of violence committed by these organizations? Which of their actions shocked you the most? And how well do you think the Mexican police and military handled them? Share your opinions in the comments section below. Now go check out Mexican Cartel Island gets raided by Texas Rangers, or click this other video instead.
There's a hidden war right next door to the United States, largely unnoticed by many Americans. Since 2006, Mexico has been in a relentless battle against powerful drug cartels. What started with President Felipe Calderón's bold move to deploy 50,000 soldiers has spiraled into a deadly conflict, claiming over 360,000 lives. These cartels, shattered into smaller and more violent factions, now wage war not just against the Mexican government, but also among themselves, vying for control of lucrative drug routes into the US. Armed with sophisticated US military-grade weapons, these criminal organizations have evolved into quasi-military forces. But how did this happen? What kind of arsenal do these cartels possess? And how did they transform from local gangs into militarized powerhouses? Stay with us as we uncover the shocking reality behind the Mexican cartel's war machine and explore the dangerous implications for the US. Although organized crime has existed in Mexico for many years, the rise of that country's drug cartels as groups powerful enough to challenge the state's authority began in the 1990s. At that time, the United States focused its anti-drug efforts on destroying Colombia's cartels. This policy was generally successful. Most notably, the infamous Medellin cartel of Pablo Escobar met its end with his death in 1993. However, the drug trade didn't magically disappear with him. It was rerouted through Mexico. The Sinaloa, Gulf, and Juarez cartels were all conceived during these years, as the lucrative drug trafficking revenues transformed local gangs into fully fledged transnational criminal organizations. The United States responded by shifting its counter-drug efforts to its neighbor next door. This focus included helping to train the Mexican military. Unfortunately, this focus would produce unforeseen and devastating consequences. Mexico's Airborne Special Forces Group was one of the units that received instruction by the US Army at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, since renamed Fort Liberty. There they were trained in counterinsurgency and counter-drug operations, training which would prepare them for things to come. In 1997, 31 members of this unit, which was considered one of the most elite in the Mexican military, defected and began working as a mercenary force for Ociel Cardenas Guillen, the leader of the Gulf cartel at the time. After he was arrested in 2003, these 31 defectors seized their chance to go their own way. With an initial roster of 300 members, the Los Zetas cartel was born. The rise of Los Zetas dramatically changed the nature of the war on drugs in Mexico. The business became much more violent and brutal. Prior to Zetas, Mexico's drug cartels relied on bribery and corruption as the preferred method of operations. They resorted to violence only as a secondary method. Moreover, certain targets like pregnant women were considered off-limits. The Los Zetas cartel discarded all of that. It relied on fear and brutal acts of intimidation to expand its reach. One notable example occurred in their early days. In 2006, as the organization was staking out its identity, it captured 2 Mexican police officers in Acapulco. These men were decapitated, and the Zetas left a message behind: "So you learn to respect us." The Zetas engaged in indiscriminate acts of torture and mass slaughter. These were military men, and they took a military approach to taking control of the territory. They would take and hold it by force and fear. The Zetas were not simply a band of highly trained thugs. They were well armed and equipped. They came with automatic weapons, RPGs, and hand grenades. They used those grenades to send another brutal message during an Independence Day celebration in September 2008 when they threw them into a parade. The attack left 8 people dead and over 100 injured. The The Zetas had demonstrated their ability to create mass casualty events, as the armed forces of a state are capable of doing on the battlefield. Unsurprisingly, Mexico's drug disputes grew far more violent once Los Zetas arrived on the scene, and far more people were getting killed in them. Los Zetas' communications and ability to coordinate their activities were also highly sophisticated, reflecting their military origins. By 2010, the Los Zetas cartel had expanded to 405 municipalities in Mexico, a reach that was over twice as large as its nearest rivals. The cartel established operations that ran from Venezuela and Colombia to the United States and even into Europe and West Africa. This would prove to be the high point for the Zetas, though. In the following years, the cartel would fragment, as pressure from both the Mexican government and rival TCOs would take their toll. By the end of the decade, all of the leaders of Los Zetas were dead or in prison. Central unity broke down, and today, splinter groups are confined to small territories, where they get most of their money from local criminal revenues, like the extortion of nearby businesses. They've been mostly cut off from the big business of transnational drug trafficking. Although Los Zetas cartel may be over as a unified organization, it succeeded in changing organized crime in Mexico. Today's cartels have none of the scruples that their 1990s and early 2000s era predecessors did. Acts of brutality and intimidation are the preferred methods of exerting influence and controlling territory. The other cartels and their successors learned from Los Zetas and adopted their tactics and weapons. The Zetas set off an arms race among the cartels, and that race continues to this day. The arms race was on display in January 2024 when a column of Mexican soldiers had the misfortune of running into an improvised landmine. This was no small IED of the type so often seen by American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. The explosion, captured on social media, was powerful enough to send a soldier flying. He died and 4 others suffered injuries. A month later, a similar incident occurred. This time, 4 Mexican soldiers died and 9 others suffered wounds. Both blasts occurred in an area along the border between the states of Jalisco and Michoacán in southern Mexico. This is a hotspot for cartel activity. The use of these landmines marks the latest evolution in the arms race between the cartels that the Zetas began 20 years ago. The Jalisco New Generation cartel is believed to have been responsible for the weapon. This cartel has replaced Los Zetas as the most infamous in Mexico. It's now considered the biggest criminal drug threat to the United States, and Mexican officials consider it their country's biggest internal security risk. The use of landmines only reinforced that notion. Some of the mines the Jalisco cartel use are set off by tripwires that are sensitive enough to be triggered by pedestrian foot traffic. For the cartels, using landmines makes a lot of sense. They're lethal and can be used without engaging in direct contact with one's enemy. They're also an ideal way to fortify your own territory. Their use is growing. Between August 2021 and July 23, Mexican authorities deactivated 2,241 of these landmines. They were spread over 17 states, with the bulk concentrated in Michoacán. These mines are also associated with foreign mercenaries from Colombia. Since landmines like this have played an important role in that country's long-running civil war, it's not surprising that these mercenaries have brought this technology with them. One local described the situation in an interview with the LA Times. There's always been a conflict with shootouts and displacements, but lately you see other kinds of people who aren't from here, who have a different accent. The rise of these mercenaries is tied to the 2016 ceasefire agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC, the nation's largest leftist guerrilla group. The ceasefire left many of the combatants without anything to do. Naturally, they used their connections in the international drug trade and found new work in Mexico. The new arrivals from Colombia have brought other weapons like improvised mortars and drone-drop bomblets. The cartels have also used grenade launchers. But the cartels don't limit themselves to these improvised explosives. Some of them have access to military-grade explosives. For example, suspected members of the Gulf Cartel were arrested in the city of Reynosa on the US border in 2018. These men were carrying 2 M18A1 Claymore mines. The cartels have outfitted themselves with the weaponry to make their armies true combined arms operations. Weaponized drones, rigged with the bomblets the Colombian mercenaries brought with them, recall what Ukraine has proposed to do with its own drones. The Ukrainians have requested the bomblets from the CBU-100 Rockeye-2 cluster bomb to drop from drones onto Russian armored columns. The United States has denied this request so far, but the drug cartels seem to be picking up the tactic. Mexican authorities claim that the use of these bomb-dropping drones is brand new. The tactic was never reported in Mexico before 2020. Between January and August 2023, though, over 260 such incidents were recorded, and that may be an undercount because the figures only include those who were wounded in these attacks. However, at least 1 officer in Mexico's National Guard and 4 state police officers were killed in another 2 incidents. Overall, Mexican authorities found 556 improvised explosive devices of all types, ranging from landmines to car bombs to drone-drop munitions in the first 8 months of 2023. Over 1,411 were found during the presidency of Manuel López Obrador. Half of these IEDs were found in the aforementioned Michoacán, which is seeing a bloody war between the Jalisco cartel and a coalition of opposing cartels. Mexico's Secretary of Defense, Luis Crescencio Sandoval, said that the explosives frequently failed to detonate because they were all homemade, based on tutorials that were found on the internet. Some of them were made with blasting compounds stolen from mines, but others were more primitive, even using black powder as the means of detonation. Although some of these devices might lack sophistication, they are no less deadly. In July 2023, 7 roadway bombs were used in a trap that killed 4 police officers and 2 civilians. The cartels are not limited to these primitive bombs. Some of the drones are armed with more powerful explosives like C4 or TOVEX. Other drones are armed with hand grenades. These explosives may come from the Mexican military. At least one former Mexican Marine is known to have conducted drone attacks with these weapons for the Jalisco cartel. The cartels have used drones in other ways, such as tracking law enforcement personnel, including across the border. In the Rio Grande Valley sector of Texas alone, U.S. Customs and Border Protection officials recorded 25,000 drone sightings and 10,000 incursions between 2022 and 23. The cartels don't limit themselves to small FPV drones either. Larger drones that can carry heavy payloads have also been used. If need be, these have the potential to carry air-to-surface missiles like Hellfires. Fortunately, the cartels have not reached that point yet, but they are becoming increasingly sophisticated with their weapons on the ground too. The cartels have begun fielding their own armored columns. These vehicles are locally known as monsters. They come equipped with steel plating and 50 caliber machine gun turrets. They are resistant to many types of small arms fire and require increasingly heavier weapons to be combated effectively. The cartels are also arming themselves with increasingly more powerful small arms. These TCOs are as sophisticated in smuggling weapons as people and drugs, and their arsenals reflect this. In March 2024, US federal authorities busted a major gun-running operation, including 100 weapons that were destined for the cartels. These firearms included 50 caliber M107 Barrett sniper rifles. The Barrett has an effective range of about 2,000 meters and is used by the US military primarily as an anti-materiel rifle. However, it's more than capable of functioning in anti-personnel roles. Some of the longest recorded sniper kills have been through the use of this weapon, including the 3rd longest on record, which took place in Afghanistan in 2012 in the hands of an Australian sniper. The demand for the Barrett among the cartels signals that they are training their own long-range sharpshooters that can engage in anti-material and anti-personnel missions. Other weapons seized in March include the FNH SCAR. The Belgian company FN Herstal created this weapon in 2004, primarily for use with Special Operations Forces. It's primarily used with a 7.62 by 51mm NATO round, although it can also use 5.56 by 45mm round in its light configuration. If needed, this rifle is compatible with a grenade launcher that the company claims can be rapidly attached. FN also claims that minimal training time is required to use this weapon effectively. Over 20 countries have it in their arsenal. The FNH M294S is a light machine gun that the US Armed Forces have used since the 1980s. It's chambered for the 5.56 by 45mm NATO round. It's belt-fed and can fire 850 rounds per minute, up to an effective range between 700 and 800 meters. The M1919 was a machine gun that saw service in the US military in the first half of the 20th century. It was originally chambered for the .3006 round, but many countries still use it today after converting it to the 7.62mm NATO round. It's belt-fed and can fire between 400 and 600 rounds per minute. 5 men were arrested in connection with the trafficking ring. These were straw purchases, the act of buying a gun for another person who is legally prohibited from owning a weapon or doesn't want to be associated with the transaction. Straw purchasing became a crime in 2022 with the passage of a gun control bill following the massacre at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas that May. The straw purchasers allegedly bought the guns from unlicensed dealers, one of whom was named as a defendant in the complaint. The official federal criminal complaint describes the state of the Mexican drug war with the entry of these weapons. They are symbols of cartel profit, power, and prestige, due in part to their high price to purchase and operate. Mexican drug trafficking cartels use these weapons to engage in battles with their enemies and exert control over their claimed territory. The March 2024 bust was one of only many. In recent years, Mexican authorities have increasingly seized military-grade weapons. The Mexican Defense Department has warned its northern counterpart that it's often finding weapons on Mexican territory that were meant for the exclusive use of the US Army. Last June, Mexican authorities claimed that they had seized 221 fully automatic machine guns, 56 grenade launchers, and a dozen rocket launchers in recent years. 5 of the rocket launchers were found in the hands of the Jalisco Cartel, 4 were seized from the Sinaloa Cartel, and 3 more from other cartels. The cartels often brag about these weapons and share pictures of them on social media. Unsurprisingly, Mexico wants an urgent investigation about how all these weapons are winding up in the cartel's hands. Ken Salazar, the US ambassador to Mexico, confirmed that the issue had been raised with him. Much of the traffic in firearms across the border comes with standard-issue civilian semi-automatic rifles being smuggled into Mexico through the United States. Mexico has sued American weapons manufacturers and gun shops, claiming that they contribute to the country's violence. The cartels have certainly altered some of these weapons to make them fully automatic. However, this is likely not the route the cartels use to get the most sophisticated military-grade hardware. Trafficking through Central America is another way the cartels are getting their hands on military-grade US weapons. This is a legacy of the Cold War, as the United States often armed factions there to battle communist influence. The best example would be the Salvadorian Civil War between 1979 and 1992, when the United States armed the Salvadoran government against leftist guerrillas. These leftover weapons have made their way to the cartels. Corruption north of the border also likely plays a role. Mexico's cartels have targeted officials in the United States. A decade ago, the US Department of Homeland Security reported that about 2,000 law enforcement officials were under investigation for involvement in organized crime. Unsurprisingly, these investigations concentrated in Texas. It's likely that some of the military-grade weapons the cartels have gotten their hands on come from corruption north of the border. The cartels have become increasingly proficient at combining these arms together in coherent operations. At the start of the year, violence rocked the town of Helidoro, Callisto, which is one of the suburbs of the city of Tlacotepec in the state of Guerrero in southwestern Mexico. On January 5th, drones and gunmen carried out a coordinated attack on at least 30 people there. Information and communication security is essential for any armed force, and today's cartels have learned from the example of the Los Zetas set. They've constructed their own Wi-Fi networks and financed them with fees extorted from locals. To more effectively launder money, the cartels have expanded into legal industries like the avocado trade. Mexico's TCOs have also forged alliances with their counterparts in other regions, especially China's triads, from which they source the chemicals for fentanyl, but also many counterfeit goods. Before their demise, the Los Zetas cartel had an alliance with Chinese gangs in Latin America, getting a cut from groups distributing pirated software. As these organizations tend to have close ties to the Chinese Communist Party, Mexico's drug cartels could find themselves armed with even more sophisticated equipment in exchange for the resources that Beijing finds desirable. At one point, the La Familia Michoacana cartel had engaged in illegal mining, with the proceeds being exported to China. Shortly after this arrangement, ties between the cartels and Chinese organized crime grew as the fentanyl crisis began to blow up. The cartels are no longer enterprises running operations through bribery and the untrained, but small-scale violence through the employment of local thugs. These are sprawling criminal enterprises with essentially private armies, effective enough to wage war and control territory with. The cartels don't have the firepower to stand up to the Mexican military yet, but they now often outclass Mexican law enforcement in weaponry and sophistication. This is a problem for the country's ability to wind down its drug war, because it means that these TCOs can now only be controlled through extreme force. Outgoing Mexican President Obrador once described his security policy as being based on hugs not bullets. However, the homicide rate in Mexico has remained at historic highs since he took office. His incoming successor, President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum, successfully reduced the homicide rate during her time as mayor of Mexico City from 17.9 to 8.6 per 100,000 between 2018 and 22. Only time will tell if she is as successful nationwide, but she will be facing a network of cartels far more powerful than any of her predecessors have ever encountered. What do you think of the prospects of Mexico's incoming president against the cartels? What might they do next? How might the United States get involved? Don't forget to let us know in the comments, and also make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out what's stopping the US Army from attacking Mexican cartels, or click this other video instead. In 2015, the murder rate in El Salvador hit a record high, at 103 homicides per 100,000 people. This made it the most dangerous country on Earth. American media outlets gave it a grim headline, the murder capital of the world. Since then, the figures have dropped. Upon taking power in 2019, President Nayib Bukele made controlling the country's gangs, which were responsible for the murders, his highest priority. However, his methods have proven controversial among the international community. When he took office in June 2019, El Salvador's homicide rate was still 35.8 per 100,000 people, still the world's homicide leader. In 2023, the country's homicide rate was 2.4 per 100,000 people, a rate lower than the United States and a rate that is the second lowest in the Western Hemisphere, behind only Canada. Perhaps the ultimate proof of El Salvador's new safe status is that fewer of its nationals are being caught trying to cross the United States southern border, with a 37% drop in apprehensions between 2022 and 23. Indeed, many Salvadorans are now leaving the United States to return to their homeland. How did this huge turnaround happen so rapidly, and why have some of Bukele's methods proven controversial enough for some to call him a dictator in the making? Let's find out. El Salvador's gang problems originate with the country's civil war between 1979 and 1992. During that war, which saw American aid to prop up the government against leftist guerrillas, almost half the Salvadoran population fled, mostly to the United States. The new arrivals were concentrated in Southern California. Living in exile, Salvadoran teenagers could only find security and comfort with each other, forming the nexus of the MS-13 and 18th Street gangs. These gang members were often deported to El Salvador during the Clinton administration's crackdown on illegal immigration and on criminal aliens in particular. The deportations brought the gangs back to their country of origin. Many other gang members remained or snuck back into the United States, and soon the Salvadoran gangs became true transnational criminal organizations. To make matters worse, the United States and international human rights NGOs pressured the post-war Salvadoran government into passing laws that made it harder to control gang activity. One of the most important of these measures was making it illegal to bring criminal charges to anyone under the age of 18. As the gangs originated among Salvadoran teenagers and frequently recruited teenagers to carry out their criminal tasks, such legal regimes only encouraged their growth. By 2019, international media sources estimated El Salvador to have about 60,000 gang members. 2015 was a fateful year for more than one reason. As El Salvador became the most dangerous country in the world by far, that was also the year Nayib Bukele became the country's prominent political figure, securing his election as the mayor of San Salvador, the country's capital. He was then a member of the leftist FMLN party, the former guerrilla group during the Civil War. But perhaps tellingly, Bukele was expelled from the party in 2017, even as he initiated a number of popular safety and public works initiatives in the city. 2 years later, Bukele only got his name placed on the presidential ballot after complicated political maneuvering. The two traditional major parties, FMLN and the right-wing Arena Party, had attempted to block his candidacy. He was nevertheless successful and elected with 53% of the vote. He was sworn into office on June 1, 2019. Only 20 days later, Bukele revealed the major focus of his presidency by announcing his territorial control plan, and this plan revealed a level of military involvement in domestic matters that would make most people in more developed countries uncomfortable. Phase 1 of the TCP, known as Preparation, included 4,000 soldiers from the armed forces of El Salvador working alongside 2,000 officers of the country's national civil police. These soldiers and their police comrades were deployed to retake control of the city centers of 12 municipalities in El Salvador that were known to have heavy gang activity. A crackdown began on the country's prisons as well, which were notorious for becoming little more than command and control centers for the gangs. Visitation rights were suspended, high-ranking gang members were transferred to stricter confinement, cell phone signals were blocked. The objective was to disrupt the gang's CNC, and it showed promise. In this phase, and other aspects of the TCP, Bukele was building on historical precedent. One of his predecessors, Antonio Saca, implemented a policy known as Supermano Dura, which allowed El Salvador's military to patrol areas under the control of the country's gangs and make searches and arrests on suspected gang members, including based on appearance alone. As gang members often adorn themselves with related tattoos, this approach was not as random as it might seem. If the first phase of the TCP was a stick, Bukele also offered carrots with the second phase called Opportunity, which was designed to secure young people a path for a future that did not involve the gangs. These provisions included new schools, sports centers, vocational training facilities, and so on. Phase 3's approach to the TCP, called Modernization, dovetailed with the first. This phase was announced in August 2019 and included equipping El Salvador's military and police forces with modern weapons, vehicles, helicopters, night vision equipment, body armor, and other provisions. The passage of the financing needed to purchase this equipment was controversial and involved Bukele walking into the legislative building with soldiers and riot police in an effort to put public pressure on legislators. Ultimately, it failed, but Bukele mobilized an additional 1,400 soldiers to continue and expand earlier parts of the TCP. Although controversial at home and abroad, there were early signs that Bukele's renewed crackdown on gangs was working. Murders decreased by nearly 50% during his first year in office, plunging from almost 2,400 in 2019 to 1,341 in 2020. Later that year, Bukele's party won 56 seats in the country's legislative elections, which gave him much greater leeway in passing his anti-gang initiatives. Even so, in 2021, El Salvador's murder rate was 18.1 per 100,000, which still made it one of the world's 20 most dangerous countries. Despite the undeniable progress made since 2015 and the measures Bukele took to accelerate that progress, El Salvador's gang violence proved persistently stubborn, and in September 2020, a report in the Central American publication El Faro suggested that the reduction in murders during his first year was not only attributable to Bukele's TCP, rather the president reportedly offered MS-13 improved prison conditions in exchange for a reduction of murders on their part and the gang's support for his Nuevas Ideas party in upcoming legislative elections. The United States Treasury Department later accused Bukele of this as well. Bukele denied these reports and accused El Faro of money laundering, which forced the publication to relocate its headquarters to Costa Rica. Bukele also initiated the next phase of the TCP, which he called incursion. Incursion involved a much heavier military presence in areas which were controlled by the gangs and which the police were too scared to enter, no-go zones. Bukele announced his intention to double the size of El Salvador's armed forces from 20,000 to 40,000 as part of this plan. Then something extraordinary happened. El Salvador's murder rate decreased by almost 57% in a year, with 651 fewer murders between 2021's 1,147 and 2022's 496. The trend continued between 2022 and 23, with the latter only having 154 homicides, a further 69% reduction. How did this come about? Unfortunately, the beginning is a dark story. For a while, incursion was working, then came retaliation. Between March 25th and 27th, 2022, 87 people in El Salvador were killed by MS-13 gang members who randomly shot at targets in the streets. These killings were unusual, as the gangs did not tend to commit random acts of violence, but rather retaliations for people running afoul of their extortion rackets or some other offense. 62 people were killed on the 25th alone. It was the deadliest single day in El Salvador since that country's civil war. In particular, MS-13 was attempting to retaliate in response to the government's crackdown on 2 bus routes in San Salvador. The gang had typically extorted revenue from the traffic on these bus routes, and the government wanted to cut this source of revenue off as part of the incursion phase of the TCP. To further warn Bukele and his government, the gangs left a string of corpses on the road to the elite beachfront neighborhood called Surf City, an area that the president had devoted a lot of resources to in a bid to attract international tourism. On March 27th, El Salvador's Legislative Assembly held an emergency session which passed the country's current state of exception. This provision was originally supposed to last for 30 days, but it's been extended ever since. El Salvador's constitution permits states of exception to be passed which temporarily suspend certain rights. These include freedom of assembly, the right to be informed of the reasons behind arrest and detention, time limits to detention, protections for the privacy of communications, and protections against compelled testimony. With these tools in hand, the government began an all-encompassing gang crackdown that extended in and outside of prisons. Meals for imprisoned gang members were reduced, both as a cost-cutting measure and as a warning. Bukele threatened that gang members' retaliation against civilians would result in all food being cut to their homeboys in prison. He said they would not get a single grain of rice, and in response to international criticism, claimed that the NGOs could have all the gang members they wanted. Bukele's government made life more miserable for imprisoned gang members by taking away clothes, reducing them to their underwear, and removing their mattresses, forcing them to sleep on concrete. In the outside world, gang members, actual or suspected, were rounded up and arrested en masse. over 56,000 arrests were made before the end of 2022, a number which covers nearly the entire 2019 estimate of El Salvador's total gang population. Arrests were made without warrants or access to legal counsel for those detained. Previous rights to a court hearing within 72 hours were also suspended as part of the state of exception. These mass arrests involved the Salvadoran army in a new way and coincided with the passage of the fifth phase of the TCP called extraction. In this phase, the Salvadoran military worked side by side with the police in encircling neighborhoods where gang members were suspected of hiding. The soldiers and cops then checked every house and every person. Anyone suspected of gang affiliation, even with little evidence, was rounded up and imprisoned. To ensure the necessary capacity, the Salvadoran government built a new mega prison in 2022, one capable of housing up to 40,000 inmates, according to government estimates. Outside sources are more modest, claiming the complex can hold a maximum of 20,000 people. Either way, it's the largest prison in Latin America. The construction of the new prison, called the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism, came on the heels of a new 5,000 inmate facility in 2021. It's situated 46 miles southeast of San Salvador. The prison is composed of 8 buildings that house 32 cells that can hold more than 100 people each. Official footage from the prison reveals that each of these cells has only 2 sinks and 1 toilet. El Salvador's prison population, which had already been growing, spiked dramatically as a result of this crackdown. In January 2024, El Salvador had 1,086 prison inmates per 100,000 people. The country now houses over 105,000 prisoners, or over 1% of its population. This rate is the highest in the world. To put this further into perspective, in 2020, the country's total prison capacity was estimated to be a little higher than 27,000. Despite the new complexes, El Salvador's prisons remain overcrowded, and they will be more crowded because gang-related detentions now result in much longer stints behind bars. The prisoners are also isolated from the outside world. They have reportedly been unable to communicate with attorneys or other organizations that might be able to advocate for them. Undoubtedly, the Salvadoran government fears that re-establishing such communications will enable gangs to use prisons as headquarters like they had for so many years before. But for Bukele, it was not enough to confine the gangs into highly secure prison complexes. Their presence in Salvadoran society needed to be completely exercised, in mental as well as in physical terms. In November 2022, Bukele ordered prison inmates to destroy gang imagery on tombstones in the country's cemeteries, starting with those near San Salvador. This measure came over and above previous measures to remove graffiti from city centers throughout the country and was in compliance with the gang proscription law passed by the country's legislature. When responding to international criticism, Bukele compared these efforts to the success of the Allies' denazification efforts in Germany after the end of World War II. Gang symbols are not allowed anywhere, not in graffiti, not at home, not on people's bodies, not on people's graves. Take the case of Germany, for example. When the Allied forces beat the Nazis in Germany, a large number of Germans were of course still Nazis. So to denazify Germany, they took several aggressive measures that are still in place today in German law. One such measure, for example, is that swastikas are banned. All Nazi symbols, not just the swastika, all of them, but especially that one, that is the best known, are banned in Germany. They aren't banned in the United States, nor are they banned in El Salvador, because we never had any problem with Nazism. In our case, of course, I personally find swastikas offensive, but we have never had that problem here. So we don't have to actively crack down on swastikas, but it's a problem they had in Germany, so they banned it. And not just on paper, they went on to destroy all Nazi symbols anywhere in the country. Anything that had Nazi symbols had to be destroyed, including tombstones. Why? Because to break something that was so interwoven in German society, it wasn't enough just to arrest the Nazi leaders and kill them. They also had to erase all Nazi ideology from German society. Here in El Salvador, thank God we never had a Nazi problem. But we did have a gang problem. It's a similar issue, because they haven't just done us so much harm like the Nazis, they haven't just been ruthless like the Nazis, they haven't just been cruel like the Nazis, but they were also interwoven in Salvadoran society. El Salvador's legislature even passed a law preventing the media from reporting on gang-related stories. Under this law, journalists can face prison terms of 10 years if they use gang sources for their stories. Meanwhile, under the state of exception, the Salvadoran government can access the communications of all civilians in the country. The military equipment purchased under the modernization phase of the TCP has likely been used as part of this mass surveillance. Despite the intrusiveness, the measures continue to work. In 2024, murder rates in El Salvador are on track to decline further. Before the start of the year, and March 23rd, there were 22 homicides. If this trend continues, El Salvador would end the year with a homicide rate of 1.5 per 100,000 people. This would see it fall below Canada and become the safest country in the Americas and one of the safest in the world. Bukele's government is committed to seeing this through. In late March, there were 2 murders in northern El Salvador. The perpetrators were members of the Barrio 18 Serenos gang. The response from the government was swift. 5,000 soldiers from the Salvadoran army were mobilized alongside 1,000 police officers. These men surrounded a perimeter with San Jose Cancasque, San Isidro Labrador, San Antonio Los Ranchos, and Potonicho as the 4 respective corners. Soldiers and police then entered the perimeter to dismantle the centers of gang activity and round up the murderers' associates. Bukele vowed in a tweet that the area would become the safest place in the safest country throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. The explainer video he posted likewise vowed that the country's security forces would not rest until the few remaining aspects of the gangs in El Salvador were wiped out. The United States government, the European Union, international organizations like the UN and Organization for American States, and human rights NGOs like Amnesty International have long been critics of Bukele, accusing his presidency as coinciding with democratic backsliding and growing authoritarianism in El Salvador. Before 2022 ended, these NGOs claimed that Bukele's government had committed several thousand human rights violations, including at least 80 deaths of those in the custody of the Salvadoran authorities. By April 2023, the number had grown to 153, and supposedly none of these inmates had been convicted of a crime. People who have been released from their prisons have also reported on the cruel conditions within them. While file footage of prisoners being herded together in their underwear is now commonly known, testimonies of those who have been released suggest crueler conditions not shown on camera. When speaking to the Insight Crime think tank, one of these former inmates, going by the pseudonym Diego, remarked on the severity of the guards. They would hit you for anything and everything. All day and night you'd hear the cries of people being hit by the guards. They had everyone perfectly under control. More grandly, Bukele, seeking and receiving a second consecutive 5-year term in office, has been accused both domestically and abroad of violating El Salvador's constitution. But for the Salvadoran people, Bukele is a hero. He enjoys some of the world's highest approval ratings and was re-elected with nearly 85% of the vote. Tellingly, there were no serious allegations of election rigging, as would be the case in a place like Russia or Belarus. To the general public of El Salvador, life is now far more preferable than it was under the terror of the gangs. Various sources that speak with the people in El Salvador unanimously report the sense of relief in their country. New businesses can form without the fear of being extorted. People can travel without fear of finding themselves under the control of the gangs. When speaking to the Associated Press as part of its story on the cemetery crackdown, ordinary Salvadoran citizens expressed a great deal of joy. There's a lot of happiness being able to visit relatives who have died. Before it was normal to see gang members inside the cemetery, but today there's no danger. Perhaps that best sums up the success of Bukele's anti-gang initiatives. Other countries like Ecuador and Honduras have requested advisors from El Salvador to help them tackle their own gang problems. However, El Salvador had a number of benefits, one of which was a more professional military and police force. These were effective resources for Bukele to call upon when the time came. In contrast, corruption is rampant in the militaries and police forces of other countries in the region, most notoriously in Mexico, where the cartels have infiltrated at all levels of command. The Salvadoran army's previous effectiveness was just as much responsible for the reduction in gang violence as Bukele's vision. But what do you think about President Bukele's gang crackdown in El Salvador? Will it be effective in the long term after he leaves office? Is El Salvador going through a period of democratic backsliding as the price to be paid for crushing the gangs? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out what's stopping the US Army from attacking Mexican cartels, or click this other video instead.
A 70% reduction in the national murder rate. That's what the government of El Salvador claimed in January 2024 following a multi-year crackdown on gangs that has seen the country declare a state of emergency and draft in the military. The country's president, Nayib Bukele, is riding high on a wave of popularity because of this approach to gangs, and it's easy to see why. According to NBC News, official data from El Salvador suggests that around 2,000 people were murdered in the country in 2019. In 2020 and 2021, that number was slashed in half as Bukele's crackdowns truly started to take effect. Killings dropped markedly again in 2022, with just 495. And in 2023, El Salvador recorded its lowest homicide rate in years, just 154 murders committed. That takes the country from having one of the world's highest murder rates to placing it just below Canada as having the lowest. It's an incredible turnaround, and it leads us to an interesting question. What if the United States followed El Salvador's lead and used its military to take on its gang problems? Before we can answer that question, we need to consider a few others. Is it even possible for the military to get involved in what technically is a domestic matter? What types of gangs would the military face, and what would its approach look like? And perhaps the most important question to start, what did El Salvador actually do that could inspire the US to emulate its approach? To answer that question, we need to rewind to April 2016. At that point, El Salvador was estimated to have around 70,000 gang members who actively contributed to the country having one of the world's highest murder rates. Turf wars were rife, with prison even seeming to offer practically no deterrence to the gang leaders. Many were incarcerated, some indefinitely, but were somehow able to run their operations from behind bars. The situation was dire, and it prompted the country's then-president, Salvador Sánchez Cerén, to come up with a plan. On the gang leader side, he presented a bill to El Salvador's Congress that would allow the prison system to isolate gang leaders, restricting visits to family and placing them in cells that limited cell phone signals. He also declared a state of emergency at 7 of the country's prisons, resulting in 299 high-ranking gang members being transferred to other facilities. Then there was the military approach, the announcement of a 1,000-member Special Forces unit to crack down on gangs in the streets. That unit would be equipped with assault weapons, armored cars, and even helicopters, with the country's then Vice President Oscar Ortiz claiming that we're going to go after them in the countryside and in the city. Those were prophetic words, as El Salvador has effectively used its military to take on the country's gangs, even after the election of a new president and vice president. However, the initial crackdown wasn't what did the trick. As we mentioned earlier, El Salvador still saw 2,000 murders in 2019, suggesting Cerén's version of a military approach wasn't working as well as he'd hoped. Enter Nayib Bukele. Elected as El Salvador's president in 2019, Bukele took his predecessor's approach and went running. In March 2022, he implemented a state of emergency across the entire country that essentially gave his government free rein to tackle gangs in whatever way they saw fit. That state of emergency is still in place. Lawmakers extended it for the 24th time in March 2024 to bring it up to more than 2 years, and it appears to have worked. Beyond the lower homicide rates mentioned earlier, Bukele's military crackdown has led to the arrests of thousands of gang members, as well as the destruction of gang communication systems. Hierarchies have been disrupted, which has left gang command structures in disarray. The problem isn't yet solved. Over 21,000 gang members were still at large by the end of 2023. However, more than 70,000 El Salvadoran gang members are now in prison, with Bukele's government having cleared the way to conduct mass trials of up to 900 members at a time, if all those members are accused of the same crime. In essence, we've seen El Salvador accept a state similar to martial law, with a military-driven police force arresting gang members, and its people appear to be happy in that situation. In February 2024, Bukele secured his second term in office by securing a staggering 83% of El Salvador's vote. The question now is simple: could what works for El Salvador and its leader work in the United States? Before tackling that question, we first need to look at the issue of scale. El Salvador's gang problem was massive, with anywhere between 70,000 and 100,000 members in a country that has a population of just under 6.4 million people. That means somewhere between 1% and 2% of the population were gang members before the military crackdown. The US has a very different ratio. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, or DOJ, there were around 1 million gang members spread around 33,000 gangs in 2011. There are no specific figures updating the total number of gang members in the years since, though the FBI now claims that there are 33,000 violent gangs, including those on the streets, in prison, and motorcycle gangs. On the surface, that would suggest America's gang problem isn't as severe as El Salvador's, at least in terms of ratios. 1 million gang members in a country of 340 million people works out to around 0.3% of the population being gang-affiliated, far lower than the 1% or 2% seen in El Salvador. But there are other challenges. Take the sheer number of gangs in the United States as an example. In El Salvador, it's believed that 53 armed groups remain after the government's crackdown. The number wasn't much larger than that before the military got involved, which allowed the country's government to hone in on the largest gangs before taking on some of the smaller organizations. Groups like the Mara Salvatrucha or MS-13 and the 18th Street were obvious targets that could have a military force dedicated to taking them down. The situation would be far more complicated in the US. Despite having fewer gang members per capita, they're spread out among far more gangs. Worse yet, the United States is huge compared to El Salvador, around 467 times larger in terms of landmass. In fact, with that landmass being divided into states that each have their own gangs and laws, introducing the military into that environment would be far more complex in operation than what was seen in El Salvador. Not simply because the military would have to be imposed on every single state, but because each state offers a different level of gang challenge. Of course, the US military is far larger than El Salvador's, which slightly mitigates the issue. Then there are the many groups the US military would need to face. It would take far too long to list all the 33,000, but some of the most prominent include the 18th Street, which is also present in El Salvador, which the DOJ claimed had between 30,000 to 50,000 members in 2008. The Bloods and the Crips, the country's most prominent African-American gangs, combined have a membership that falls anywhere between 35,000 and 55,000. The Gangster Disciples may have as many as 50,000 members, with the Latin Kings also having around 35,000. That's without mentioning many prominent gangs, such as the Hells Angels and the Aryan Brotherhood, that also have memberships in the thousands. The point is that the US military would be facing gangs in some cases that are nearly as large as the combined numbers in El Salvador. Each of those gangs has its own culture, its own hierarchy. That means that a one-size-fits-all approach on taking them on wouldn't work. Each would require the military to devise a specific plan focused on that particular gang, including analysis of member capabilities to enact any sort of plan. Speaking of plans, it's not like the US has nothing in place to combat these gangs already. The FBI alone currently operates 3 major anti-gang initiatives. The National Gang Intelligence Center is one of them. Established in 2005, the organization gathers intelligence on gang activity, which it uses to support law enforcement. It's also responsible for identifying the gangs that present the highest threat to the US at any given time. Granted, it isn't directly responsible for taking on gangs on the streets. That's left to law enforcement and other FBI groups, but the information it holds would be an invaluable resource should the military get involved in America's gang problem. There's also the Transnational Anti-Gang or TAG task forces the FBI has created to directly tackle the 18th Street and MS-13 as they try to expand their influence in the US. You may recognize both as being the main targets of El Salvador's crackdown, and the existence of the TAG task forces shows us that the US takes them very seriously. However, these TAG groups don't operate in the US. They're working in places like El Salvador and Honduras to try to dismantle these gangs in their home bases. Closer to home, the FBI also operates the Violent Gang Safe Streets Task Force, through which it collaborates with local law enforcement agencies to take on gangs at the street level. There are 160 of these task forces spread throughout the country, most of which engage in gathering evidence to build cases against gang members. Consensual monitoring, Title III wiretapping, and financial analysis all fall under the force's remit, vital for providing evidence in firearm investigations, drug conspiracies, and other gang-related crimes. So, not only would any military crackdown have to contend with the sheer number of gangs in the US, but it would also have these anti-gang organizations to consider. Does it cooperate with them, co-opt the information they have before taking over? The odds are that it would be the former, with the government essentially rolling these anti-gang organizations into one giant supporting group for the military. But that brings us to another challenge the military would face: legal issues. The mention of evidence gathering is key here, as the US operates on a system where everybody is considered innocent of a crime until proven guilty. To maintain that system, the military and the government wouldn't be able to replicate actions such as El Salvador approving mass trials that could involve up to 900 suspects at a time. It would be easy to make the argument that this is unconstitutional, and it amounts to stripping away the rights of US citizens. Opposition to military action against gangs would be inevitable. Then there's the Posse Comitatus Act to consider. Introduced in 1878, this law prevents the US military from participating in any form of civilian law enforcement unless it receives express authorization from either an act of Congress or based on the Constitution itself. As constitutional arguments would be easy to levy against the idea of using the military to tackle the gang problem, having the right to a fair trial could prevent many of the actions taken in El Salvador. The government would have to rely on congressional approval to use the military to take on American gangs. Granted, this act only applies to the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force, but that doesn't mean the government could use the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps with impunity. They're bound under a similar law, according to the Brennan Center. But there are ways around this act. Barring congressional approval, which would prove difficult to achieve given the divided nature of Congress, the Insurrection Act could provide a legal workaround to the Posse Comitatus Act. Under the Insurrection Act, a state government can request the aid of a federal military to help suppress an insurrection in the state. That act also allows the U.S. president to use the military to enforce federal law in a state, even without that state's approval, as well as to protect the civil rights of specific groups of people. There are also potential loopholes. Take the District of Columbia National Guard as an example. The only National Guard in the U.S. that operates under the president's control. All others are controlled by states or territories. The D.C. National Guard has a special militia status. That means it's considered non-federal despite being controlled by the president, and it's thus not covered by the Posse Comitatus Act. Could that provide a workaround for the federal government? All National Guard units could be granted the same non-federal status under the president's control before essentially being granted the military powers required to take on America's gangs. It's possible, though it would likely require a large amount of legal wrangling. Let's assume all these issues could be overcome. Would the military then be able to act as a police force in the United States? Perhaps, though it's arguable whether or not it would be bound by use of force rules. In an April 2022 article by the National Defense University Press, Dr. Patrick Patterson points out, most military combat operations are governed by law or armed conflict or LOAC treaties. The Geneva Convention is a good example. These LOAC treaties dictate what is illegal as a use of force on a battlefield in a state-on-state conflict. The problem? LOAC treaties won't apply if the U.S. uses its military to take on domestic gangs. Armed conflict isn't occurring by the terms of the legal military definition, even though any fight between the military and American gangs would involve violence and the use of firearms. This creates something of a gray area where the military is expected to operate within certain guidelines, but it's unclear what those guidelines might be. In this case, it would likely be up to the country's governments, both at the federal and state level, to decide the rules of engagement for the conflicts. We saw this in El Salvador. Its government not only opened the way for the military, but created a state of emergency and came up with new forms of trial to tackle gangs. The U.S. government likely wouldn't go so far, mostly because it would face a backlash if it traded away too many freedoms for the sake of taking on gangs. A state of emergency opens the door to human rights violations, as Human Rights Watch (HRW) points out in El Salvador's case. Specifically, it cites a conversation with a mother whose son was arrested in El Salvador, who claims that the police officers essentially told her, "We can arrest anyone we want." Therein would lie a major task for the U.S. government, finding a way to bring the military into play without infringing on the rights of citizens as enshrined in the Constitution. The point is, there are likely more barriers in store for any U.S. government that wants to use the military to tackle gangs than there are in El Salvador. After all, there's a reason why Nayib Bukele has referred to himself, albeit jokingly, as the world's coolest dictator. Despite El Salvador currently being a democracy, several organizations suggest that its democratic vehicles are slowly being dismantled. Felix Ulloa, the country's vice president, even proclaimed as much, according to the Wilson Center. He said, "To these people who say democracy is being dismantled, my answer is yes. We are not dismantling it, we are eliminating it. We are replacing it with something new." The U.S. isn't going to dismantle its entire democratic system to bring the military to fight against its gangs. But what would happen if it did? If all these legal, democratic, and human rights issues didn't exist, leaving the U.S. government with free rein to use the military to take on gangs, what would that look like? At this point, we can only speculate, though there are several routes down which the conflict could go. One route, which seems extremely unlikely, is that many fractured gangs throughout the United States somehow organize themselves into a united force to fight back against the military. That's a near impossibility. So much of gang culture revolves around territorialism, and trying to get the heads of over 30,000 gangs to all agree to join a fight against a common foe seems unlikely. Even if we focus on the largest gangs in the country banding together, there are major issues at play. Would the Aryan Brotherhood work alongside the Crips and Bloods, for instance? It seems likely that conflicts in gang culture and ideology would destroy any thoughts of joining up to fight before they got off the ground. Still, if that were to happen, a straight battle between the U.S. military and the combined might of the country's gangs would only end in one way: a military victory. Even in terms of pure manpower, the military would have the advantage. It boasts 1.328 million active members, according to Global Firepower, as well as nearly 800,000 reservists. That's without mentioning the sheer gulf in equipment. These gangs would be bringing standard firearms, a limited number of explosives, and everyday vehicles to fight against a force that has tanks, jets, helicopters, and a navy. There's no question who would win. But that's also not what's going to happen. The far more likely route for the U.S. military to take would be a regional approach that sees it cooperate with the FBI and state authorities to root out gang leaders and members and imprison them. In that sense, the military would essentially become an extension of the organizations the U.S. already has in place. These organizations would be relegated to intelligence gathering, with the military serving as the hammer that hits the nail when it's time to make arrests or engage in direct conflict with the gang. It would essentially be a divide-and-conquer strategy, aided by the fact that American gangs are already clearly divided along territorial and ideological lines. However, there are challenges to this approach. To counteract the use of the military, gang members may go even deeper underground. Rather than operating with impunity, they would make a greater effort to blend in, leading to the military only being able to go after those with known affiliations. Even accounting for that, confrontations between the military and the gangs would happen on a street level, creating the possibility of collateral damage. Much of the military's strongest equipment, such as fighter jets and tanks, likely wouldn't be used so as to minimize damage to infrastructure. There's also the civilian issue to consider. According to the New Humanitarian, 6.6 civilians per 100,000 members of El Salvador's population died due to gang warfare in 2019, with that number occurring even when the initial crackdowns on the country's gangs were in place. It's not too much of a stretch to believe that the U.S. military declaring war on America's gangs would actually increase the risk civilians face in areas where those gangs are most prominent. Any failure to arrest gang members or entire groups could lead to shootouts, creating the possibility of unintended targets being hit by both the gangs and the military. At worst, the military approach could lead to entire regions of the U.S. becoming no-go war zones, where street-level guerrilla warfare is rife and the average person is in danger. El Salvador has experienced a similar issue. Its solution has sometimes been to place entire regions under siege. At least that's what happened in August 2023, when the country's military deployed to Cabañas to essentially lay siege to the area. Cabañas is a rural region that's slightly larger than New York, with the country's military combining with its police force to create what the BBC dubbed a security fence around Cabañas. All told, there were 7,000 soldiers and 1,000 police officers in the fence, placing the entire region in a sort of military quarantine. Nobody could go in or out without the military say-so. This idea of barring access to certain areas isn't new in El Salvador's crackdown. It regularly establishes checkpoints near areas that have known gang presences, with those passing through the checkpoints forced to provide ID and proof of address. Vehicles and backpacks are searched, as are bodies. The El Salvadoran military would strip search anybody it considers suspicious to check for gang tattoos and similar evidence. These checkpoints would also allow the military to build up a presence within the region, which proves useful when conducting raids on houses and gang facilities. Perhaps that would be a better approach for the U.S. Rather than fighting gangs on the streets, its military could establish similar checkpoints and security fences, allowing it to check up on anybody who passes through. Of course, that brings us back to the issues related to freedom of movement and freedom from government intrusion. Would American citizens be as welcoming of these intrusions as El Salvadoran citizens? And even if they are, would the military be able to dedicate enough resources to enforcing what amounts to regional martial law throughout all 50 states when it also has global concerns to consider? After all, nobody is looking to El Salvador to essentially serve as a protector for the rest of the world. It can dedicate a huge portion of its military to taking on gangs. Could the U.S. do the same against a backdrop of a world that sees Russia fighting against Ukraine, Israel battling Hamas, and the raft of geopolitical issues those conflicts bring? Perhaps not. Finally, there are issues to consider outside the logistics of enforcing a military crackdown on American gangs. Take public opinion. According to an October 2023 Gallup poll, the majority of Americans, around 54%, believe that the federal government is already trying to do too many things that should be left to individuals and businesses. Gallup concludes that the baseline assumption is that the federal government is already overstepping its bounds, just in terms of regulatory issues and interfering with state policy. It's difficult to imagine an America in which the majority who want less federal government interference would welcome the idea of military crackdowns even if they were to dismantle gangs. There's also the prison issue. In April 2024, AP News reported that around 241 people arrested as part of El Salvador's gang crackdowns have died in prison, many without ever going to trial. That number might be even higher, with Humanitarian Legal Relief saying that it received reports of 500 deaths, though it's only able to confirm half of them. Another report covered by AP News goes deeper into the causes of those deaths. Almost half, around 44%, are the result of violence or serious torture, with another 29% occurring due to the deceased not receiving the medical attention they require while in prison. It would be naive to think such issues are absent in U.S. prisons. But even so, they are major human rights breaches that could become prominent. The Bureau of Prisons already believes its prison population will expand to 10% over the system's current capacity by 2024. Introducing up to 1 million new inmates into that already overcrowded system could bring prisons to their knees, opening the door for corruption or simple neglect as a result of the system being overburdened. For any military takedown of American gangs to actually happen, therefore, short of simply killing gang members on the street, capacity would have to increase to account for a near doubling of the current prison population. Still, all that might be worth it if gangs are eradicated, right? Using the military to destroy gangs would slow down the national drug trade and put a huge dent in the number of firearms deaths that occur in the U.S. every year. At least, that's an easy assumption to make. But it may not be accurate. While El Salvador may claim to have reduced homicide rates by 70% following its military crackdowns on gangs, it's unlikely that even a best-case scenario would result in a similar decrease in the U.S. That's according to USA Facts, which examined gun homicide statistics from 2021. Besides the fact that those types of homicides were at their highest in over 2 decades, rising 30% on the 2020 figures to hit a rate of 6.7 people per 100,000 in 2021, it also discovered something interesting. Very few of those gun-related fatalities were linked to gang violence. There is a caveat here. Of the firearms incidents for which specific circumstances were reported, 55% occurred due to unknown issues. It's possible that many gang-related incidents fall into this category, though it's equally possible that other circumstances led to those deaths. Of the 45%, 20% were attributed to arguments that turned fatal, while 14% were a result of domestic violence. As for gang-related deaths, only 3% were directly linked to drug dealing, with another 1% being gangland-related and less than 1% being attributed to issues with juvenile gangs. At most, that means that only 5% of the firearms fatalities in the U.S. that have confirmed circumstances were related to gangs. Those statistics demonstrate the key difference between El Salvador and the U.S., at least in relation to gangs. While gangs are a problem in both countries, El Salvador's gangs have reached the point where they could operate with near impunity. Plus, the country's government and justice system allowed for the implementation of martial law, which many in the country think is necessary because of the massive impact gangs were having on their everyday lives. Gangs obviously impact the lives of ordinary Americans too, and it would be unwise to suggest that there are no areas in the U.S. that are no-go zones due to the existence of gang activity. Still, gangs are responsible for fewer gun-related deaths in the U.S. than they are in El Salvador, which, combined with gangs not being a prominent problem in the lives of most people, suggests that sending in the military would be overkill. And that's not to mention the many issues related to human rights, civil liberties, and the federal government overstepping its power that could result from the U.S. using the military to take on gangs. So, would the military be able to help the U.S. clear up its gang problem? Absolutely. Even if it limits itself to working alongside existing law enforcement, the military has the training and equipment needed to take on gangs at the street level and potentially make thousands of arrests. The biggest question isn't whether the military would succeed, it's whether it should be allowed to try. We'll leave the answer to that one up to you. Let us know what you think it would take for the US military to start a crackdown on gangs. Is it even legally possible given America's democratic and judicial systems? And even if it was, would Americans be willing to give up their liberty, even if just temporarily, to eradicate gangs from the streets? Tell us what you think in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go check out how El Salvador Army destroyed their brutal gangs, or click this other video instead.
In July 2023, Mark Green, the Republican chair of the House Homeland Security Committee, made a shocking announcement. The former U.S. Army major, who now represents the state of Tennessee in Congress, claimed that it was very likely that China was managing to insert military personnel into the United States. How? By sneaking them through the border between Mexico and the U.S. Green claims there has been a massive surge of Chinese nationals being encountered at the border, and that many of those nationals are military-aged men with known ties to the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, and even China's ruling Communist Party. That's worrying stuff for intelligence officials in the United States. But are Green's claims all they're cracked up to be, or are there reasons beyond the militaristic one for why we're seeing such a large influx of Chinese nationals trying to make their way into the US via Mexico? This video explores the answers to that question, and we start by digging deeper into Green's claims. Green's comments came during the same announcement in which he told the media that he, along with some of his congressional colleagues, would be launching an investigation into Alejandro Mayorkas. Currently serving as the Secretary of Homeland Security, Mayorkas is overseeing what some are calling a border crisis, accentuated by the recent death of a migrant child who had been taken into US custody. It appears Green's approach is simple. Not only may he criticize Mayorkas for that unexpected death, but he'll use the opportunity to bring up the possibility that his oversight of the border between Mexico and the US is so subpar that he's allowing national security threats into the country. He could even point to comments from Melissa Dalton, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Security, as his evidence. In March 2023, she claimed that China, in addition to Russia, was now finding ways to pose more dangerous challenges to the safety and security of the US homeland. Sending operatives into the US via the Mexican border could be one of those ways. Green also has data to back up his claims. According to Newsweek, which pulled data from the US Customs and Border Protection, or CBP agency, 2023 saw an alarming spike in confrontations with Chinese nationals at the border. Between October 2022 and April 23, the CBP reports 9,854 encounters with Chinese nationals. The figure for the entire fiscal year prior, running from October 2022 to September 2023, was just 2,176. That certainly seems like a sudden influx, and the news could be even more worrying to the security conscious when you consider the makeup of the 9,854 encounters. Newsweek reports that only 1,500 of those encounters included individuals who were crossing as part of a family unit. The other 8,304 were all single adults. We don't know much about those adults. Were they men or women? What were their ages? None of that information is publicly available, nor has the US government made any claims that these individuals had any defined ties to Beijing. Still, that vagueness in itself is a worry. Green also has backing from some independent sources. Those include Dr. Rebecca Grant, who serves as an analyst at Iris Independent Research. She spoke to Newsweek about the issue, claiming that she personally believes Green's claims that China is sneaking operatives into the US via Mexico to be true, at least in part, pointing out that there were 5.4 million Chinese nationals in the US as of 2021. Grant says it's not a huge stretch to believe at least some of these people have ties to Beijing. And as she puts it, if you're a bad guy that wants to infiltrate operatives into the USA, the southern border is a pretty easy way to do it. However, Green is less than forthcoming when quizzed about the sources behind his claims. All he's said is that he's got information from a border sector chief, adding that he'll be taking part in a classified briefing on the issue in the very near future. Grant says that briefing is really a case of no smoke without fire. She points out that not having any additional information isn't unlikely, given that the intelligence community isn't going to provide public figures in terms of how many potential Chinese infiltrators it has caught. But the mere fact that Congress is going to be briefed on the situation suggests that something is going on. We can also dig deeper into the numbers to see the sheer scale of the Chinese influx. According to CBS News, 2023 saw the US CBP record a staggering 2.5 million instances of turning away or detaining people attempting to cross the border between the US and Mexico. That's a record-breaking number, suggesting that more people than ever are trying to make the journey. But in line with Green's claims, Chinese migrants represent the fastest-growing group among that 2.5 million. Interestingly, not all of those Chinese migrants are trying to make the crossing via official channels. CBS even recorded footage of several large groups, many seeming to be from middle-class family backgrounds, managing to sneak through a 4-foot gap at one end of a border fence that sits just 60 miles east of San Diego. All they had to do was duck under some razor wire and they were inside the country. CBS also offers more numbers related to how many Chinese citizens were apprehended trying to cross the border illegally. Startlingly, they're even higher than the numbers that Newsweek reports. CBS says that the US CBP reported the apprehension of around 37,000 Chinese citizens attempting to cross into the US in 2023, a number that's 50 times more than that recorded in 2021. Of course, the caveat here is that 2021 also saw restrictions on Chinese movement at an all-time high as a result of the pandemic, so it's no surprise that 2023 brought with it much higher numbers. You could even argue that many of the 37,000 are Chinese citizens who would have attempted the crossing earlier were they not stuck in China due to pandemic restrictions. Still, it's more fuel for Green's fire. Not only can he point to suspicions that he and others in the independent media and intelligence community have about China sneaking operatives into the US, he can also highlight the record-breaking numbers of Chinese citizens trying to make the crossing. Naturally, not all of those citizens will be involved in subterfuge. Some merely want to escape China to build a better life for themselves, which we'll dig deeper into later in the video. But as Green and Grant suggest, it's highly likely that at least a small portion of the 37,000 who were detained in 2023 would have had a nefarious purpose for making the crossing. Even more numbers come from AP News. It claims that 22,187 arrests of Chinese citizens were made at the US-Mexico border between January and September 2023, which roughly tracks with the 36,000 number that CBS shared. It also points out that this is 13 times the number of arrests made in 2022, with September 2023 alone recording 4,010 arrests. That's 70% more than the number of arrests recorded in the previous month, suggesting that Chinese citizens started attempting the border crossing in higher numbers toward the end of 2023. By the end of September 2023, Chinese people became the 9th highest nationality in terms of pure volume being arrested at the border, and led the way for nationals from countries outside of Mexico, Central America, and South America. And as Newsweek also points out, the majority of those arrested were single adults. By now it's clear, more Chinese nationals are trying to enter the United States than ever before. But does that really lend credence to Green's claims that the US faces a national security threat from this increasing number of attempted border crossings? Or are there other reasons at play that may account for the rising numbers the US CBP is reporting? To answer that question, we first need to provide context on the sheer amount of danger a Chinese citizen faces when attempting this border crossing. It isn't a simple task, as highlighted by a short interview held by CBS reporter Sharon Alfonsi with a Chinese college graduate who claims that it took him 40 days to travel from China to Los Angeles. Alfonsi asked the student what countries he had traveled through to make the journey and received a laundry list of nations in response. Before the student even made it to South America, he had traveled through both Thailand and Morocco. From Morocco, he reached Ecuador, traveling from there through Colombia, Panama, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica before he finally reached Mexico. And even after all of that traveling, he still had to make his way through Mexico itself, all to finally reach the 4-foot hole in the border fence mentioned earlier to finally get into the United States. Alfonsi only had one word in reply to that journey: geez. However, that journey isn't typical for all Chinese nationals attempting to make the crossing. Alfonsi also highlights that many, especially middle-class migrants, tend to fly from China into Ecuador first. That's easy for them to do. Ecuador doesn't require Chinese nationals to apply for a visa to enter the country, with a 90-day tourist visa automatically offered to anybody who makes the trip. All the traveler has to do is ensure they have a Chinese passport, valid for at least 6 months, as well as documentation showing that they intend to depart from Ecuador. For many middle-class Chinese migrants, that documentation comes in the form of plane tickets to Mexico. Specifically, they head to Tijuana, according to Alfonsi, where they link up with snakeheads. These Chinese gangs work alongside Mexican cartels to then smuggle Chinese citizens into the US. You could argue that this represents a less perilous journey than the college student's crossing, during which he traveled through around half a dozen countries, but it's still dangerous to associate with the gangs to try and get into America. Plus, there's the cost. The snakeheads charge $400 for a 1-hour drive to the 4-foot gap. Add the air travel from China and then Ecuador into the mix, along with paying for the connections to the smugglers in the first place, and the trip can cost upwards of $14,000 all told. Either way, the journey into the United States isn't easy. It either involves traveling through multiple countries, taking around 40 days, or working alongside smugglers and spending huge amounts of money to sneak inside. All of which brings us back to a question: why are so many Chinese nationals taking these risks and spending this money? Green has already made his case, at least for a few of those nationals. They're not migrating, illegally or otherwise, into the United States to find a better life, at least not all of them. A select few are entering the country to spy on Beijing's behalf, perhaps with the goal of delivering valuable intel about the American military to the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. This would be far from the first case of China trying to find ways to get information about the United States. Green points to the infamous Chinese spy balloon incident of February 2023, in which a balloon of Chinese origin spent several days flying over the continental United States. Eventually, that balloon was shot down by an F-22 fighter jet and would have been shot down sooner if it hadn't been above land. China claimed the balloon was simply a weather tracking device that had gone astray, but many in the US were up in arms about the possibilities, even in the wake of the revelation that the balloon actually wasn't collecting any intelligence. That was confirmed by CBS News Sunday morning in an interview with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. Milley said the intelligence community, their assessment, and it's a high-confidence assessment, is that there was no intelligence collection by that balloon. Still, even if the famous balloon wasn't spying, that's not to say there haven't been other incidents. In February 2021, the Cato Institute published a paper that examined the cases of 1,485 people who were convicted of espionage or espionage-related activities in the United States between 1990 and 2019. Of that 1,485, around a third, or 583, were born in America. The other 902 were either born in other countries or had unknown origins, with the paper confirming that 184 were born in China. But that wasn't the end of the story. The paper also discovered that though 184 Chinese-born spies were found in the United States during a 29-year period, several more were spying on China's behalf. Specifically, 276 of the 1,485 people arrested were sending information to Beijing. Interestingly, 24% of that 276 were people born in the United States, with a further 7% coming from Taiwan. Nevertheless, the paper shows that China has been sneaking spies into the US since at least 1990, raising questions as to how it's been doing it. Border crossing from Mexico into the US is as sensible a suggestion as any. It's also worth pointing out that China hasn't exactly been welcoming of the concept of America deporting the illegal immigrants it catches back to China. In April 2024, NBC published a report highlighting how China has often refused to take back citizens who have been caught attempting an illegal border crossing. The issue is so important that Alejandro Mayorkas, the subject of an upcoming investigation being fronted by Green, says that he's conducting high-level discussions with China about the issue. His goal is to create an agreement that would see China take back citizens that the US wishes to deport. Mayorkas says, "We have been working with the People's Republic of China to actually receive individuals who we've determined are not eligible to remain in the United States." Add to all of this the claims by the America First Policy Institute, or AFPI, a think tank formed in 2021 known for its right-wing leanings, that there were 1.8 million gotaways between 2021 and 24. A gotaway is someone who crossed the US-Mexico border while actively evading law enforcement and who managed to enter the country illegally. There's no way to know who these gotaways are or where they came from, but the AFPI suggests that it's not unreasonable to assume that many are Chinese nationals who may be working for Beijing. So what have we learned so far? It's clear that China has a history of sending spies to the United States, as highlighted by the Cato Institute. The country also refuses to take back many of the citizens the US wishes to deport, perhaps suggesting that it's happy for its operatives to be detained and potentially released into the United States at a later time to carry out their missions. And if the AFPI is to be believed, there's also a chance that the 1.8 million gotaways that occurred between 2021 and 24 contained a substantial number of Chinese operatives who successfully snuck into the United States without being caught. However, we also saw that not every accusation of spying made toward China by the US is accurate. Such was the case with the famous spy balloon, which the US later found had collected no data that would suggest it was spying on America. That may also be the case with the Chinese migrants. There's another side of the story that could reveal why so many Chinese citizens are choosing now to make the dangerous journey to the United States, and it has nothing to do with spying or inserting military operatives into America at all. Rather, it's about escaping. That may seem like a strange concept when you consider China's position in the current geopolitical landscape. Some call it an emerging superpower, pointing to its rapidly modernizing military and the fact that it has the world's second largest economy as reasons why those born in the country should want to stay. It's a major player already, and it's only going to get stronger. And yet, thousands are leaving, even as China appears to be undergoing what its president Xi Jinping has called a national rejuvenation. Why? The answer is that rejuvenation for a nation doesn't mean success for all living in that country. In a January 2024 report covering the underground industry behind the walking route that many Chinese people choose to take through South America into the United States, CNN noted that many in China feel repressed. Part of that comes as a result of the strict pandemic lockdowns Xi implemented, which lasted for about 3 years and left many in China out of work. Reports of China's stuttering economy, its property market is struggling, and youth unemployment is high also suggest that it's not as powerful financially as it appears from the outside looking in. Many are fleeing simply because they are unable to find work at home and want to escape to the US for a chance at a better life. They're also attracted by the relative freedom they might have if they make the border crossing successfully. Facing increasing restrictions on their civil liberties, free speech, and even their religion, it appears that many making the crossing are doing it because they're at the end of their ropes. They're willing to risk it all, enduring a dangerous journey before they even make it to the US for a chance at something better. One middle-aged Chinese man, who CNN spoke to at an encampment where several Chinese people had gathered while waiting to be picked up by the US CBP, gave a simple answer for his reason to leave. "We are Christians." The Pew Research Center points out that Christianity inside China is governed by a strict set of rules, which have seen online evangelizing banned, as well as registration required for churches. Prominent Christian leaders have been arrested, likely because of their refusal to register, and worshipping Christians are essentially banned from practicing their faith outside of registered venues. Muslims face even worse restrictions, with Pew stating that various human rights groups accuse China of surveilling, locking up, and even torturing up to 1 million Uyghur Muslims in the country. None of this is to say that there's no chance that some making the crossing have ties to China's military. That's certainly a possibility. Rather, it tempers any thoughts that all Chinese citizens crossing into the United States have nefarious purposes in mind. The vast majority are simply looking for something that's better than what they have, a life free from the increasingly strict restrictions being imposed on them by their homeland. Still, that could serve as a smokescreen for the few who are operatives. They can claim to be part of the huddled masses trying to get into the US because they're escaping China, hiding their military links in the process. All of this brings us to a final question. What is the US doing about the problem of China sneaking military personnel into the country? We've already seen one answer in America's efforts to convince China to accept Chinese citizens that it wants to deport from the country. That alone would see many of those caught being shipped back, though that would cover both groups of people trying to escape Xi's policies and those who might be sneaking in for militaristic reasons. Another approach lies in the proper identification of those that the US CBP catches. Speaking to Newsweek, an official from the Department of Homeland Security claims that American border troops use biometric and biographical data on those they encounter at the border to identify any individuals who have links to criminality or terrorism. He says that anybody found to have such links, or any other links that might suggest a threat to national security, is detained and not released into the United States. The US CBP's website provides context into how these biometric processes work. When somebody presents themselves for entry into the country, they're asked to stand in front of a camera. That camera is linked to the CBP's cloud-based facial matching service via an encrypted connection, which is essentially a massive database of passenger travel documents. The camera takes a picture. From there, the system matches the live image to any existing photo templates already on the CBP's database. A successful match usually leads to the migrant moving into the inspection stage, in which a CBP officer examines their documentation and determines the legality of their attempted entry into the United States. However, a successful match can also reveal details about the migrant's past activities that could lead them to being denied entry. The same goes for photos that don't reveal a match. The CBP normally takes that as a sign that the individual is trying to enter the United States illegally. That's all well and good for the people the CBP detain at the border between Mexico and the United States, but what about the many others? 1.8 million over 3 years, according to the AFPI, who are gotaways that get in without ever encountering any border agents. The solution to that problem isn't immediately apparent. The Department of Homeland Security mentions closing the legal loopholes that smugglers, nefarious actors, and human traffickers currently exploit to sneak people into the country on its website. However, it offers little information about how it intends to do that. The same organization also mentions deploying the National Guard to the border, though that would do little to stop those who are able to enter via the exploitation of legal loopholes. It may also do little to prevent the gotaways from occurring, especially when you consider that the border between Mexico and the United States is 1,933 miles long, a huge amount of ground to cover for the National Guard and CBP. One thing is certain, China has been sneaking military personnel into the United States via Mexico. How many is up for debate, with the odds being high that it's a small number compared to the sheer volume of Chinese citizens attempting to make their way into the country. Nevertheless, Green, along with several others, has identified this as a national security threat for the US. And it's a threat that requires a solution. That's where we'll hand over to you. How big of an issue do you feel Chinese military personnel sneaking into the US via Mexico actually is? What would you do to solve the problem, and do you think the Department of Homeland Security and the US CBP are doing enough as it stands? Tell us what you think in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out The Hack That Made China a Military Superpower, or click this other video instead. The US is currently in the grips of a devastating opioid crisis. Whole communities have been destroyed, families torn apart, countless lives destroyed or ended prematurely. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDCP, more than 1 million people have died in the country since 1999 from a drug overdose. Since then, the problem has only gotten worse. But why? More than 75% of drug overdose deaths in 2021 involved an opioid, in effect, prescription drugs. The vast majority of these deaths, nearly 88% in all, involved synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Staggeringly, that's 10 times the number recorded 25 years ago. A Newsweek report from 2022 puts this in even starker terms. More Americans have died from fentanyl overdoses than in the entire Vietnam War. What makes these figures even more chilling is the unlikely source of the ingredients, or precursor chemicals, that go into making fentanyl: China. At this point, you'd be forgiven for asking the obvious question: why would China be manufacturing and exporting the ingredients for a synthetic opioid that's decimating US towns and cities? Is there something more sinister at play here? Is China deliberately trying to destroy the US with drugs? That's what we'll attempt to answer in this video, and be warned, the reality of the situation is both shocking and unexpected. But before we go any further, let's take a closer look at the synthetic opioid that's causing the most damage in America today: fentanyl. What is fentanyl exactly, and why is it having such a devastating effect? According to the American Addiction Center, fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 more times powerful than morphine. First developed in the late 1950s, it has potent and fast-acting pain-relieving effects. Typically, the drug is prescribed for patients recovering from surgery and those in extreme pain. More generally, opioids are substances that work in the nervous system of the body or in specific receptors in the brain to reduce the intensity of pain. However, the effects of fentanyl don't last very long, hence the reason it carries such a dangerous potential for abuse. When someone takes fentanyl, particularly in large doses, it doesn't just relieve pain, but also creates a sense of euphoria or extreme relaxation that's associated with many illegal narcotics. Often mixed with other drugs such as cocaine or methamphetamine, fentanyl frequently leads to accidental overdoses resulting in fatal respiratory failure. More pertinently, it's cheaper to manufacture than most drugs and much easier to transport than heroin. Ultimately, this drug is hugely addictive and thus in huge demand across America and beyond. And if something's in huge demand in today's world, there will inevitably be a supplier. That's where China has struck up an unlikely alliance with the Mexican drug cartels. Highly persuasive evidence points to Chinese precursor chemicals being transported to Mexico in staggeringly huge amounts. In drug-making facilities across the country, the cartels then refine these substances into fentanyl and other opioids and smuggle them into the US. But let's take a step back for a moment. What about the legal ramifications of handling these chemicals in China? After all, Beijing has always taken an incredibly hard line on drugs. You only need to take a look at the current legislation to understand just how hard that line is. In accordance with China's Article 347 Criminal Code, no matter the amount of drugs a person smuggles, traffics, carries, and/or manufactures, they shall be sentenced. In China, the most popular drugs are heroin and crystal meth. If a person smuggles, traffics, carries, and/or manufactures an amount of over 50 grams, they may be sentenced to death by shooting. That's right, a firing squad. If the amount involved is less than 10 grams, a sentence of around 7 years is to be expected. And drug crimes are taken so seriously in China that those accused don't usually get bail after they get arrested. So if the possession and manufacture of substances are so strictly controlled and punished, how are Chinese companies managing to produce enough precursor chemicals to devastate so many towns and cities in the US? This is where the issue gets a little thorny, to say the least. The drug laws in China and the US are very different and quite complex, to be honest. While the US can effectively put a blanket ban on any and all drugs containing a certain ingredient, China's legislative powers are much more cumbersome and unwieldy. Lawmakers can only ban individual drugs as they are developed or come onto the market one at a time. For that reason, laboratories in China can simply rebrand the same drug and freely distribute it both domestically and internationally. Put simply, if X drug is banned, the manufacturers can simply call it Y and carry on selling it. Naturally, this renders the drug laws, no matter how tough and uncompromising they look on paper, effectively useless. Bryce Pardo, a drugs policy expert at the Rand Corporation, paints a vivid picture of the country's limited regulatory capacity. Gaps in regulatory design, the division of responsibility between provincial and central governments, and lack of oversight and government and corporate accountability increase opportunities for corruption. And it's this corruption and these precursor chemicals that are being processed by the Mexican drug cartels and smuggled into the mainland United States. It's a situation that's fueling what many are calling a devastating form of asymmetrical warfare on the United States, and what's been costing so many lives over the last quarter of a century or more. Now, terms like asymmetrical warfare and precursor chemicals may sound like very modern concepts in a very modern, sophisticated, and stealthy type of 21st century attack. Think election interference and corporate cyber attacks. But in reality, the current opioid epidemic has a solid and identifiable precedent in history, to the extent that many commentators feel that China's actions may well be an act of revenge rather than a new tactic or the ever more complicated and ever-shifting geopolitical battleground. To explain, we need to travel back to the 19th century and what Western scholars call the Opium Wars and the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. Around 170 years ago, the British attempted to flood China with opium. To cut a long convoluted story short, the British had taken a particular liking to the tea, porcelain, and silks available on the Orient, only they didn't have the financial resources, literally enough silver, to procure these goods in the numbers they wanted. This led to a huge trade deficit and an inevitable conflict. Remarkably, this huge demand for tea in England triggered what, in today's parlance, could easily be classified as a drug war. British merchants began to export opium and, to a lesser extent, cotton from India, one of its most prized colonies back then, to China. At the time, opium was illegal in England but was used in traditional Chinese medicines. Note that the recreational use in China was also illegal and not widespread at this point in history. The British started shipping tons of the drug, using a combination of commercial loopholes and outright smuggling to get around any bans or legal impediments. In a relatively short period, great swathes of the Chinese population became addicted to opium, and demand for imports of the drug exploded. Ultimately, this led to an unfavorable trade balance paid for by a steady loss of China's silver reserves. The figures tell us just how devastating this story was for Chinese society. 13.5 million addicts, with around 25% of the male population hooked on the drug. Opium dens flourished across the length and breadth of the vast nation. Whole communities were destroyed, families torn apart, countless lives destroyed or ended prematurely. Sound familiar? Naturally, this almost decimated the Chinese economy, weakening the social and political structure of the country behind the simple fact that a huge chunk of the available workforce was unable to physically work. They had been chemically incapacitated by the huge amount of potent drugs the Brits had been shipping into their country, and all because of the UK's new obsession with a cup of tea. The Chinese response was brutal, but it wasn't really until Chairman Mao's reign and the Great Leap Forward that the country went to some lengths to get the opium epidemic under control. Mao forced some 10 million addicts into mandatory treatment programs, executed countless numbers of opium dealers, and destroyed and replanted the opium fields. This point is worth bearing in mind, as we'll take a deeper look at how the US should tackle the opioid crisis later in the video. For now, let's return to the Mexican drug cartels and exactly how fentanyl and the precursor drugs that go into making it are finding their way to the US via China and the cartels themselves. According to a report in the UK newspaper The Guardian from May 2023, the US Attorney General Merrick Garland called the Mexico-based Sinaloa cartel the largest, most violent, most prolific fentanyl trafficking operation in the world. But they are just one link in a chain connecting the cartels to Chinese companies and criminal organizations, relationships that are now drawing increasing attention from the US government. In response, Chinese officials deny any connection between Beijing and illicit fentanyl production and export, and their arguments have some foundation. The country's leadership was the first to schedule the opioid as a narcotic, in effect criminalizing it. Furthermore, a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson claimed that Mexico had yet to notify China of the seizure of any illegal precursor shipments to the cartel's so-called super labs, which turn those precursors into fentanyl. Yet the evidence of the relationship between the cartels and Chinese entities is nothing new. US law enforcement agencies have tracked the cartel's supply chains and money laundering networks ever since they expanded into China almost a decade ago. In fact, when fentanyl first started appearing in street drugs, most of it was found to be sourced from China. But the cartel's links to China don't end there. In a BBC report from October 2017, the US authorities issued the first ever indictments against 2 Chinese individuals for conspiracy to distribute large quantities of fentanyl as well as other opioids. Even more worryingly than the ease with which this drug can be produced is that it's being sold directly on the internet and sent by post, either directly to the US or to trafficking networks based, you guessed it, in Mexico. From the same BBC report, the European Drug Monitoring Agency made the following remark. It appears that most shipments of new fentanyl coming into Europe originate from companies based in China. So despite Beijing's firm rebuttals, there is increasing evidence that China is indeed leading the source of the problem. Worse still, there is now a deepening rift between Washington and Beijing, driven by accusations of intellectual property theft and spying, as well as geopolitical strains from issues such as Taiwan and the war in Ukraine. All crucial aspects in an increasingly high-stakes political chess match which is threatening to engulf a world already teetering on the brink of disaster and potentially a nuclear conflict. And what about the Mexican drug cartels? What part are they playing in the plot to destroy the US with drugs? These organizations now control vast areas of the country and are responsible for political corruption, assassinations, kidnappings, international money laundering, and of course, drug dealing activities. There are 4 main players on the scene: the Sinaloa, Jalisco, Gulf, and Los Zetas cartels, mostly based in the northwest, northeast, and west of Mexico. Over the years, the cartels have constructed a vast network of drug-making and distribution facilities in the towns and cities. Despite the devastation they wreak, not just abroad but domestically as well, they are often championed by their own people for standing up to their evil imperial overlord, the very same United States of America. Now that we've highlighted the problem in detail, it's time to look at the solutions available to the US. For many, there are only 2 viable strategies. Firstly, a legalistic approach, and the good news is that steps have already been taken to reclassify opioids into Schedule I substances. Back in May 2023, a bill was approved to do just that, make fentanyl a Schedule I substance, the most dangerous classification of drugs. According to a CBS report, this will allow for tougher penalties and prompt further research into a drug that has claimed thousands of American lives. Note that in the broader legal definition, Schedule I drugs don't have any medical use and are highly lethal. US Republican Bob Latter from Ohio has campaigned tirelessly for these new laws to be enacted. For too long, our nation has battled an opioid epidemic fueled in recent years by illicit fentanyl and its analogs, which claimed the lives of more than 5,000 Ohioans and 70,000 Americans in 2021. Our constituents need the solution. Lives are on the line if we do not act. This is a hugely positive step in the right direction, no doubt, but how effective the new legislation will prove to be is up for debate. Remember, America has been conducting, and to more cynical observers losing, a war on drugs long before President Nixon made it part of his administration's policy back in 1971, stating that the drugs were public enemy number 1. The Smoking Opium Exclusion Act of 1909 banned the possession, importation, and use of opium for smoking. The Prohibition laws, a spectacular failure, came along around 10 years later. There was the Marijuana Tax Law of 1937, a Controlled Substances Act (CSA) in 1970, Nancy Reagan's famous Just Say No campaign, and the subsequent Anti-Drug Abuse Act of the 1980s. And perhaps most tellingly, the more recent legalization of marijuana in several states and the District of Columbia may herald new, more liberal and effective policies. The point being, just because legislation is introduced doesn't mean the problem is going to magically disappear. That's where option number 2 comes into play. The declaration of an all-out war on the Mexican drug cartels responsible for refining these drugs and smuggling them into the US. And by all-out war, we mean sending troops into the country and literally destroying the cartels at the source and putting them out of commission on a permanent basis. But how likely is such a radical and blitzkrieg approach? Ultimately, an all-out assault on Mexican drug cartels would be a tricky proposition to sell to both Congress and the American people. The economic ramifications alone could spell disaster for many industries. But why? There are many legal issues tied up with launching any such attack. Principally, the US government would have to redefine the status of the drug cartels through the US courts as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs. Then President Joe Biden would be legally entitled to deploy military force to overcome the drug problems posed by Mexico. If the drug cartels were designated as FTOs, however, it would have the aforementioned crippling economic effects on Mexico. Some experts estimate that it could hit the tourist sector particularly hard, and when we say hard, we're talking to the tune of $20 billion or 8.5% of its GDP. Naturally, people would be scared of traveling to a country riddled with terroristic elements. Other economic arguments are just as compelling. Trade between the US and Mexico alone is worth $72.1 billion. Huge figures that can't be discounted. But it isn't something that hasn't been discussed between the two governments. Since 2006, when Mexican leader Andrés Manuel López Obrador declared his own war on drugs and the cartels that control them, 360,000 citizens have been victims of drug-related homicide. Despite partnering closely with the US, receiving billions of dollars to modernize its security forces, reform its judicial system, and fund development projects to curb migration, no real or lasting progress has been made. With all these provisions in place, Washington had hoped to stem the flow of illegal drugs into the country by bolstering security and monitoring operations along the border, but to no avail. Furthermore, there are serious logistical obstacles that may be almost impossible to overcome. The cartels are far from stupid and far from easy targets. The drug-producing facilities are invariably located in the hearts of towns and cities, in built-up, highly populated areas. If, for instance, the US were to launch a drone strike against the cartels, there would be a considerable risk of massive civilian casualties, something no US president wants to face. Worse still, the cartels routinely recruit impoverished child soldiers to both deal the drugs and patrol the streets on their behalf. Again, the last thing the US government wants is the image of dead children being transmitted across the world. For all of the above reasons, military action is as unlikely as it is unworkable. But perhaps that will all change come November. It's no secret that the US presidential election takes place later in the year. At the time of scripting this video, it looks increasingly likely that current incumbent Joe Biden will face off against former President Donald Trump again. Any short to medium-term strategy to foil China's sinister plan to destroy the US with drugs lies very much with whoever will be in the White House come next year. So what are Biden and Trump's views on drugs? Historically, throughout his political career, Biden has earned a reputation for being tough on crime, for some, too tough. To illustrate this point, back in 1989, at the height of punitive anti-drug and mass incarceration politics, Biden, a senator then, went on national television to criticize a plan from President George H.W. Bush to escalate the war on drugs. Quite frankly, the president's plan is not tough enough, bold enough, or imaginative enough to meet the crisis at hand. He backed this stance through the late 1980s and early 90s by writing many of the laws that helped build a punitive criminal justice system that enacted more incarceration, more prisons, and tougher prison sentences for drug offenses, particularly crack cocaine, which had reached epidemic proportions at the time. And while his stance may have softened somewhat during his election campaign and subsequent victory, Biden introduced the National Drug Control Strategy in April 2022 to combat the very overdose epidemic we've put under the spotlight in this video. Similarly, Trump has also adopted a hard line on crime, both in and out of office. According to a CNN report from 2020, the federal government under Trump attempted to combat addiction and overdose deaths from opioids, setting restrictions on opioid prescriptions, calling for a public health emergency, and launching ad campaigns aimed at young people who might abuse the drugs. Furthermore, Trump's administration expanded access to the opioid overdose antidote known as naloxone and made concerted, if not hugely successful, efforts to convince China to cease illicit fentanyl production and exporting, among other efforts. A bitter trade war ensued. Tellingly, both men have been touched by drug-related tragedies in their families' lives. Trump's brother's death due to complications from alcoholism was the reason why he's been a teetotaler throughout his adult life. Meanwhile, Biden's son's struggles with substance abuse have been well documented, not always compassionately, in the media ever since his election. All of which suggests that the opioid crisis would be high on both men's agendas should they be re-elected. Whatever the solution, one thing is clear: America has to act quickly and decisively before millions more lives are destroyed by fentanyl. However, the real and abiding worry for US citizens, those being impacted by fentanyl on a daily basis, is the current international situation. And perhaps it's this which brings us full circle. If China really is trying to erode US social structure by flooding the country with a highly addictive drug, such global instability is playing right into Beijing's hands. At present, the world's eyes are glued to the war in Ukraine, Israel's increasingly brutal incursions into Gaza, Iran's recent drone attacks over Jerusalem, and the very real and worrying possibility of a nuclear conflict. For that reason, even the biggest and most powerful nations on the planet have domestic blind spots. And while the figures flagged up at the top of the video are staggering, such an oversight on the US's behalf could have truly significant ramifications later down the line. By the time the global situation has calmed down, it may already be too late. Conspiracy theories aside, it's hugely unlikely that the Chinese government has been directly involved in the manufacture and global distribution of illegal drugs into the US. But that's not to say they aren't fully aware of the situation, and it's perhaps their unwillingness to both act and cooperate with their American counterparts that tells the true story. For the time being, we can only watch this space and hope for a positive outcome. Now we're coming to the end of the video. It's time to ask you what you think about the current crisis that's ravaging American society. How do you think the US should tackle the opioid situation? Will new legislation be enough to solve the problem? Alternatively, would targeting the Mexican drug cartels responsible for shipping opioids into the country with military action be the best tactic? Or would the US be better off confronting the source of the problem, China? If so, how would Biden or Trump go about it? Diplomacy, economic sanctions, proxy wars? Let us know in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out the hack that made China a military superpower, or click this other video instead.